grateful, very happy to have you here. My name is Lila Vasilescu. I am the director of the Verita Foundation, the main organizer of this event. And I must say that compassion in education is just as interesting as it is a hard topic. But I think it is high time we address the hard topics, especially in education. So even more for that, I thank you for making this effort, because it is an effort, to be here with us today and hopefully even tomorrow, as we will slowly go deeper into this very important matter in education in general. So I would very much love to share to you a little bit about our work, but to do that, I will first share with you my favorite story of all times, and a story that inspired me at the beginning of the foundation when we started our work. So the story is about a man who was walking on the beach one day when he noticed something very interesting. There was a little boy who was picking up something from the sand and was throwing it in the ocean. And so the man came closer and closer to see what's going on. And he asked the boy, "What are you doing?" And the boy looked at him and he said, "There are these starfishes in the sand and I want to throw them back into the ocean because otherwise they will die." And so the man looks at him and he tells him, "Come on, are you serious? There's miles and miles of beach. Can you imagine how many starfishes there are? There must be thousands and thousands. You cannot possibly make a difference. You cannot possibly save them all." So the boy looked at him politely, bent over, took another starfish, threw it in the ocean, and he said, "I made a difference for that one." So this is my favorite story because in the beginning of the work we were doing in the foundation, I found myself many times struggling with the needs that were around us. I was all of a sudden open to all of this suffering in many ways, whether it was children sick with cancer in hospitals or children in villages that had nothing. So I struggled many, many times. And then one day, this struggle was eased the moment the mother of a boy who had died of cancer held me in her arms, and looking into my eyes, she said, "There is such gratitude for all the moments we have spent together with my son, especially in the last days. And my heart is filled with love." And so in that moment, I realized that there can be gratitude after suffering, and it opened my heart in a way that helped me continue the work we were doing. So I have a question for you. I want you to take a little moment and think of the times you felt like you were on this beach surrounded by so many starfish you want to save. How many times you were maybe in your family or in your classrooms trying to fulfill the needs of others. And then also, I would invite you to think of how many times maybe you were the starfish in the sand that didn't have a voice to ask for help, or that didn't have the courage to ask for help. So, to me, the biggest joy for today is the fact that we connected with people who are deeply touched by bringing more compassion in their lives, whether it's education in classrooms or it's with our children in our homes. That's another matter, and we'll have the time for these 2 days to go more deeply into it. So with the Verita Foundation, what we put our hearts into is looking at compassion and looking how it affects our lives. And so when we realized that it comes down to the care we have for ourselves, because we are in the educational field, we thought of 3 ways we can have an impact. And so we went to these communities where you have these amazing children who come to school, but who sometimes maybe come in the morning being hungry, or come in the morning with not having slept so well, or having problems in their own families. So then the first step we thought about was providing these basic needs for these children. And then we thought, okay, they are surrounded by these amazing people, these educators, who have decided to dedicate their lives to being around children. So as a mother myself, I know it's hard, even with one child. And so we thought, these people need all the support they can get. And I think lately, we haven't looked at this so much. We haven't looked at the role educators have in a society and in our lives. In my life as a parent, even if I hadn't been connected to education, I want my son to be in a place where his mind is just as touched as his heart. And then the second step we decided would be to offer this support to these educators, to all of the people and to all of the parents who want to go deeper into the needs we have to educate the hearts of our children. And then the third step was to offer also the context. You know, we go to these amazing schools where you have these dedicated teachers, but you enter the classrooms and you see sometimes that maybe they don't have heat, or maybe the bathroom is somewhere very far away outside, or there's so many educational materials lacking. And so with all the joy of providing the support for the teachers and the trainings, you have to look at the reality and give support in all the ways possible. So these are the 3 ways that we aspire to make a change in education. And to tell you a little bit about our main guest. We had a beautiful volunteer from India a couple of years ago, Ashima. In many ways, this is all possible thanks to her, because she made us the connection with Service Space, this amazing organization, and with NIPUN. And it felt so soothing in many ways to see that there are so many people out there who are trying to bring help in education and in the world. Sometimes you can feel really isolated when you have to do your work every day and you don't even have the time to connect with other people who maybe are struggling just as much as you are. And maybe that getting yourselves together would help. So when I learned about NIPUN and when I saw his work, I was so deeply touched. And the first thought was it would be my dream come true to have him come to Romania. And so I had to pinch him at the airport when he arrived because I wasn't sure if he's real or not. And now because we know he's real and that he's here, I would like you all to give him a big round of applause.
Got loud. Let's see if I can put my timer on. Compassion and kindness, thank you. I'm happy to be here. This is my first trip to Romania, and it's been really heartwarming few days, thanks to Lidiana, which is what her family calls Lila. I want to talk about compassion, of course, this idea of building a bigger we. So I think I'll start with what is compassion, and then why compassion, and then how do we grow compassion. Those are sort of the 3 things. And maybe if we have time, we'll do question and answer. And we're here for a day and a half, so even tomorrow we can do some things later on today. We want to get deeper into these things. So that's the rough plan. I want to start with a story. Usually I like stories, but we can throw in science if you guys want to go in that direction as well. But let me start with a story. This is a friend of mine. His name is Jacob Needleman. He's also written many books, but just a really sweet guy. And at some point, he was in a classroom, and he asks everybody, he says, how did you learn how to be good? And they had defined what good meant to them. And so everyone raises their hand and says, I learned from here, I learned here. And this one gentleman raises his hand and says, I learned how to be good from my 5-year-old. And so everyone turns around and is like, how did you learn from your 5-year-old? He shares this beautiful story of how he had taken his 5-year-old to Mexico. So they had this debate back and forth, and then the kid saw that the father was a little serious, and so he's like, okay, I'm going to have to give a toy. Which toy should I pick? So he picked his least favorite toy. You know, he's like an enterprising kid like me, so now I'm not going to give him. So dad looks at him, and he says, son, not that toy. Give him your favorite toy. And at this point, the son just starts crying. Right? He's like, no way, I just got this. There's no way I'm going to give my toy. But dad looks at him in one of those, I don't know if we have Lion King fans in here, but the Mufasa Simba moment, right? Like, it's like, no, son, give him one of your favorite toys. And so the kid begrudgingly, he takes his toy and he's going outside and he's going to go deliver that toy. And father says, I want to encourage him. So when he comes back, you know, I'll tell him he did a great job. Maybe I'll tell him I'll replace it with the same kind of toy. He has all these strategies in his mind, but lo and behold, this kid comes back with a huge smile on his face. And he looks his dad in the eye, and he says, Dad, that was amazing. Can I do it again? And this is a 5-year-old. And this is really the spirit of compassion in the sense that we all have examples. I could tell you story after story. This is my little niece, and at some point she's like, I want to grow up, I want to help people, what should I do? And she's talking to my wife over there, and my wife, in India we call aunties masis, you know, and so, Masi, what should I do when I grow up? I want to be a people doctor or an animal doctor. But, you know, I think I should be an animal doctor because people are all the same, you know, that's boring. But animals are all different, so I want to help animals, you know. And then they go back and forth, and my wife's sister is there, and she says, you know, I think you should become a chef so you can cook for me and Dad. You know, and she's like, no, Mom, you don't know what you're talking about. And then they talk, and they say, what's you going to tell me? I want to help people. What should I do? And this is very intrinsic to all of us. We all have stories with little kids who don't even, you know, who may not even conceptualize kindness, may not even conceptualize, you know, the neuroscience of compassion. Where do we have Andrea somewhere here, right? But they know it. So it's very natural to us. But what we end up conflating is, if I were to ask all of you, this happened with one of my friends recently, if I were to ask all of you to go out and do an act of kindness, and I do it with you, and we come back and I ask you, how much of that act of kindness was sympathy, how much of it was empathy, and how much of it was compassion? Because, looking at your brain scans, I could tell you, because these are 3 different neural networks that are arising. So, do we have the awareness to know? And if we don't, what ends up happening is that we actually we cheapen compassion into sympathy. We think it's pity. I have, you don't have, let me help you. But when you look, there's a beautiful quote. It says, when you help, you see the world as weak. When you fix, you see the world as broken. But only when you serve, you see the world as whole. So if our bodies know the difference between sympathy, empathy, and compassion, what is actually the difference between them? Empathy, sympathy is a very low bandwidth way of giving. Empathy, it turns out, is where I start to feel your pain. And that leads to burnout. But it is compassion where I feel your pain, but I'm able to differentiate it. I don't feel it like it's my pain. I'm able to differentiate between your emotion and my emotion. And that's a deeper expression of generosity. And so what are the properties of this kind of compassion? I mean, this is an open question. And the Buddha had a very beautiful phrase. He says, somebody went up to the Buddha and says, there are so many virtues, you know, and now there's compassion too. Which one should we focus on? And he said that compassion is like a footprint of an elephant. All the other virtues get embedded in that footprint. So it's a giant virtue, it's a giant capacity that we are capable of, but we need to grow into that. This is Rachel Naomi Remen, also somebody who has written many books and just a remarkable human being. This was her when she was a doctor, and she realized that there was no compassion in the medical world. And so she started to sensitize the whole medical world. She's now done these intimate workshops with 33,000 doctors, you know, and she was the first, sort of very pioneering woman in the whole medical field. And so we were with her recently, and she told us the most beautiful question. And the question goes like this. It says, when did you first realize that the suffering of others mattered to you? And she says she would go to these very hardened doctors, and she would ask them this very simple question. When did you realize? Like we are too many of us here, but if you had a small circle and you asked everybody, when did you first realize that the suffering of others mattered to you? You would get the most amazing stories. And it's really worth reflecting on. And so what they ended up doing is they would get amazing stories. So there was this one woman, she said, well, when I was 5 years old, I remember my mom would send me to school with lunch every day, and one day I was eating that lunch, and all of a sudden I see a dog. And the dog looks really pale and weak, and he's looking at me, and I'm looking at the dog. And I said, you know, I think the dog is hungry. So I gave the dog my food. The second day, I was sitting in the same spot, and the dog was right there, and the dog is looking at my food. I'm looking at the dog. I'm like, I think he's hungry again. So I gave up my lunch again. Did it for 5 days, and he says, you know how moms have a way of knowing everything, even though you don't tell them? You know? So it's like, oh, yeah, I think, mom says, what are you doing with your lunch? And she says, oh, nothing, you know. And then mom figures it out and says, there are so many stray dogs in the country, you're not going to be able to solve this problem. You need to make sure you are fed. And gives him a huge lecture. What does she do the next day? Next time she's in school, she's sitting in the spot, the dog is looking at her, and she can't help but give the food. And she's sitting here as a doctor at Harvard and remembering this, and she's saying, oh, I did that for 3 straight years because I realized suffering of others mattered to me. They go around in a circle, there's another kid, right? Another hardened, tough guy, I'm going to go out and they have 6 minutes per patient, and then you go from one to the next to the next. You're grilled to be really rough and tough, and he's sitting there reflecting, when was the first time I remember? And mostly people don't say, oh, when I was in my 30s this happened, or when I was in my 20s. They usually remember times, even for all of us. If we were to meditate and think on it, we might remember times from our childhood. Most everyone does. And so this guy says, when I was 2 years old, my mom would put me in a bathtub. Like the highlight of my week was when I would get a bathtub bath, right? So I'd get up and put me in the bathtub. And the bathtub had 2 little feet, and so he thought it was alive. You know, he had his whole theory in his mind. He remembered this all the way into med school. And he says, one day, my mom was toweling me off after my shower, and one day I slipped. And my foot got caught a little bit in the drain, and it started bleeding. And again, so my mom gives me this lecture of that's a dangerous spot. You will never put your foot over there. That's going to hurt you. That's not good for you. The drain is a dangerous place. So the next time, after his foot was healed, he's in the bathtub again. He sees in the bathtub, he finishes his bath, and he sees that when the water is released, the water, water goes around in a circle. So he's like, oh, that drain, that's a dangerous spot. And the water is so scared. And so it's going around because it's a really tough thing. And so you know what he does the third time he goes in the shower? He takes a little washcloth and he puts it there so the water doesn't get hurt. Right? And this is a 2-year-old. And he realizes that the whole institution, the whole sort of his upbringing to be at an elite university, to do something that is so remarkable, like medicine, he's really lost touch with this part of himself. But it's there. It's present in all of us. So how do we, here's a little video. So you might think these are anecdotes, right? So they've actually studied this. And they say, you know, people like you and I, we're mostly adults here, people like you and I need theories, need concepts, need like constant reinforcement. No, no, the world is kind. No, the real world doesn't work like that. You know, all these voices in our head. But they've done so much research on really young 18-month-olds, 14-month-olds, and how they respond to compassion. Take a look at this video here. I hope we get audio. Let's see. Yeah. He's trying to get in, and he needs help. And they've done repeated experiments. Here's another one. He's hanging, he drops a pin. He says, oh, I can't reach it. And the video goes on, right? It's this, and so they have tons, under academic scrutiny, you see it again and again and again, that we are wired to be kind, we are wired to be compassionate. It is fulfilling to be interconnected. But it is hard to grow up as a kid these days, because we have so many forces that beat this out of us, that make us forget. And by the time we get to be our age, then we're all thinking, oh my God, like this can't be real, this is not so. But you look at something, I don't know how many of you have Googled this idea of nag factor. Marketers, you know how when you take kids and they're like, they nag and they say, oh, I want this, I want this. Marketers study that. You notice how kids' cereals are always at the bottom. Not so you can bend down and get it for your kids, so the kids can look at that and nag. So we actually have these phenomena. It's called the nag factor. You have, you know, this is really shocking. This unboxing phenomena that's like the last few years. Right? You have these viral videos. This one has 108 million views. You have so many, countless videos on YouTube with millions and millions and millions of views, where all they're doing is just unwrapping a gift. And we treat these young hearts that are so compassionate, we treat them as consumers, so much so that all they want to do is like, oh, you're opening something material. I want to be a part of that. Right? I want to see what it is. And just the video, you watch it on repeat again and again and again. This is the kind of world that we're creating. This is how we're using young minds. It's a sad kind of thing. And then you get a little older, and this is everyone trying to take a selfie with Hillary Clinton, and no one is looking at her, right? So we create these technologies where it's like, oh, what's, you know, our face-to-face connection, a hug, a smile. There's so much going on between two people, but now we've created these technologies and designed them in a way where I don't even need to, because what's your greatest use is the pixels that you are on my Facebook wall. And that's not anybody's fault, but that's the culture that we are creating. Why have we created these kinds of technologies and not other kinds of technologies? These are open questions to be held. And I think one of the big challenges is that we've started to put price tags on everything. Right? This is the cover of Economist magazine. Right? Back in the days, so you know, you look at a purse and you say, oh, that's, you know, I can rent my purse out for the weekend. Did you know you can do that? Right? There's so many apps. But then you start looking at everything in that way and you say, oh, my dog is $5 a buck. And they sound shocking, but there's so many such apps that let you commoditize things that you previously would do just for the love of it. So it becomes very hard to stay connected to what that 18-month-old was doing, saying, oh, you need help? Let me open the door for you. For free. Yeah. They don't even know the concept of free or not free, you know. And so the problem with putting a price tag on everything is that we lose connection with the priceless. And a lot of these things are absolutely priceless. And when you start to do that, it doesn't end here, because you can start to go in this direction. That, look, I can't motivate my kids. What should I do? Well, can you bribe them? Can you pay them to come to school? Because it's a big problem, and it turns out, this is cover of Time magazine, it says new major study reveals that it actually works. So it is effective in a certain narrow frame. You have to ask the question that why have I lost the kids and their connection to their intrinsic motivations, that I need to bribe kids to go to school. And there's a whole philosophy that goes down this track. Because then if you can pay kids to go to school, why don't I pay them to do homework or to do chores? And there's apps for that, right? Then why don't we pay them to eat vegetables? Research finds that, yeah, it's true. So there's a whole direction of thinking in this way when nature has wired us to be kind and compassionate to go in this direction. This person here, this is a 4th grade teacher, and I think he puts it really well. And he frames the question, and he says, look, it's fairly straightforward, at least superficially, to prepare students for an exam, to teach them content that they need to know, they might need to know. He's like, I've been doing that for a long time, that's fairly straightforward. But the world we live in has very different challenges now. And he says, but what about preparing for an unknown future, for a future we cannot imagine? Things are changing so fast, so rapidly, and we don't really know how are we going to prepare our students for an unknown future that we cannot imagine. How might we craft educational programs that help students develop capacities for creating a future that you and I cannot see? Previously, change was so slow that we would be like, oh yeah, those adult teachers, they kind of can see where this is going. But now, it's so fast that we cannot even imagine what's coming up, what the next generation is going to face. How are we going to equip our educational systems to respond to that? These are hard questions. There's a short video, I'll play a short video, about how when we don't do that, what happens? When everything is changing so fast and we don't have the inner capacities or the outer capacities to handle that change, we end up creating a lot of barriers. Right? Instead of bridges, we end up shrinking. And this is what we're seeing around the world. This is how I think. I'm on the left, I'm on the right, I'm on this side, you're on this side. We have these intense polarities, intense fragmentation that we're seeing all over the world today. Here's John Howell describing it.
Of all the forces shaping politics and power around the world, perhaps none are more important than our sense of who we are and who we are becoming. We are in a period of accelerated change in at least 4 areas: globalization, technology, the environment, and demographic change. We can only process so much change in a short period of time without experiencing anxiety, which is a normal biological reaction. But how we respond to this anxiety is social. Our response is greatly shaped by the stories presented by leadership and through culture. These stories speak to our deepest values and our core beliefs about who we are, many of which operate at the subconscious level. We can respond to these changes either as a threat or as an opportunity. The first response is breaking. The second is bridging. Breaking can create a deep fear of other groups, making it easier to accept false stories of us versus them. Breaking perpetuates isolation, hardens racism, and builds oppressive systems, while driving our politics and institutions toward anti-democratic and inhumane practices. The other response is bridging, which calls on us to imagine a larger, more inclusive we. When we bridge, we see demographic change and our diverse identities as positive and enhancing who we are. Bridging calls on us to engage in healthy dialogue and requires us to listen deeply. Bridging does not mean abandoning your identity. Bridging means acknowledging our shared humanity, rejecting that there is a them, and moving toward a future where there is instead a new us. But when we bridge, we not only open up to others, we also open up to changes within ourselves, where we can participate in creating a society built on belonging.
So in this polarized world where we have been stripped of, where we have systematically forgotten about our intrinsic propensity towards compassion, how do we increase compassion quotient? How do we build a bigger we? Compassion quotient, you may say, like we know about IQ, intellectual quotient. In the last 10, 15 years, we've kind of known a lot about EQ, emotional quotient. But what is compassion quotient, and how do we grow it? One of my favorite stories of this compassion quotient is this guy named Julio Diaz. Julio was working, he's on the East Coast in America near New York. He worked at a nonprofit, and every day he would take the train back home. One day he's taking the train back home, and this guy, young kid, comes up to him with a knife and says, "Give me all your money." And he says, "Okay, you've got a knife, I don't have anything, here you go, here's my wallet." Gives him the money. And the kid is about to go and leave with the wallet. He says, "Hey kid, it's a little cold. Do you want my jacket too?" So now the kid is very confused by this whole phenomenon, right? He says, he's like, "Okay, do you go back for more?" Like, and with it's like they don't. Like I always think of this as like, okay, do they teach you this in Robbery 101? What are the pros and cons? What are you supposed to do? So he comes back and he takes the jacket. He's like, "Yeah, it is a little cold. I do need a jacket." He takes it. And now he's about to go take his jacket and go the other way again. And this guy calls back. He's like, "Hey kid, I'm about to go to dinner. Do you want to join me for dinner?" Also not taught in Robbery 101. What do you do, right? Like, do you go? Is this a trap? What's going on? So he says, "You know what? I'll go." They go to dinner. And of course, Julio is such a nice guy. Everyone in the restaurant knows him. And they have this beautiful conversation. At the end of the meal, there's a check. There's a bill that comes. And Julio says, "Hey, look, kid, I would pay for you, but you have my wallet." So what does the kid do? He takes out his wallet and gives it back to Julio. And Julio goes one step further and looks at the kid and he says, "Hey kid, can I ask for one more thing?" He says, "Sure, what's that?" Because by now they have a deeper connection. He says, "Can I have your knife too?" And the kid gives him the knife. Now you look at that story and you say, "I want to scale Julios of the world because we have so many problems in the world. Let's have everybody turn into a Julio and let's have a certification program where you come in like a normal NIPUN and by the end you are a Julio Diaz. And here's the recipe and I'm going to have my teacher." It doesn't work like that. It is so contextual. Or you can't just go to people and say, "Okay, whenever you get robbed, son, remember, go and take him out to dinner." Not a good idea. So how do you start to really look at compassion? And when we start to think in this way, right, we ask the question, how do we amplify compassion quotient? By and large, we use a manufacturing mindset. We use a factory mindset. The manufacturing mindset says, okay, you come in one end, you apply the same recipe, and you rinse, lather, repeat. It's the same thing, and out comes somebody that's much better. That's the manufacturing mindset. But really, the more appropriate metaphor for compassion, or something that's already innate to us, is actually a more gardening metaphor. You don't garden and say, "Oh, it's Tuesday, where's my tomatoes?" And it's not predictable. It doesn't just depend on you. You have to do your bit, but the sun also needs to do its bit. The wind also needs to do its bit. The rain also needs to do its bit. So you do your bit, and then you have to really trust in the other elements. It takes a whole ecosystem. It's very different than a manufacturing mindset. So all too often, we are stuck in factories and we say, "Oh, how do I scale this up the same way I scaled, let's say, my STEM skills?" But it doesn't quite work in the same way. So this is, I think, the fundamental challenge with amplifying compassion quotient, is that we ask the wrong question. Compassion cannot be manufactured. It cannot even be taught. It actually grows, and we can nurture that field as we get more familiar with it. And our usual model, this is Ed Fido in the UK, our usual model is this teacher model, if you want to call it the savior model, whatever model, right? You come in, you teach, sort of like what I'm doing now. This is the usual model, one to many. And when you look at this, he cited this, Ed cited this I was on a panel with him, and he said, on average, this is in the UK, A child says 4 words per lesson in an inner city state school. That's 2 hours of talking over a 5-year secondary school. Because we look at them as empty and we say, I need to fill them up, and then by the end, they will be this product. It's a very manufacturing mindset. 2 hours in classroom that they're speaking in an interstate school over a span of 5 years. How can we make it much more interactive? And the good news here is this, is that we used to have this model of one-to-many. This is the TV world that we grew up in. Right? One of us, and I mean there's a TV, TV's broadcasting. You can't really have a connection with the TV. So if you're broadcasting to 50 people, let's say a group of people here, how many connections do you have? How many relationships do you have? 50. Right? Like right now, you would have 50 connections. But what happens in a telephone world? We change all of that. We can actually connect on a one-to-one basis. So if everyone connects with each other, how many connections do you have? I'm already showing my punchlines here, but it's 1,225. This is just network theory. This is just math. I come from the Silicon Valley, so I have a little bit of math in me. So 1,225, right? Think of all these 50 people, they all connect with each other, and how many relationships and connections would you have? 1,225. But now, imagine you're no longer in the TV world, which is one-to-many, or the telephone world, which is one-to-one, but now you're in the internet era, which is many-to-many, which is a group-forming network. So I can create a group with 2 people, I can create a group with just 1 person, or 2 people, or 3 people, these 3 people, all different combinations. So in a group full of 50 people, think about it as a classroom. You're in a classroom with 50 people. How many unique connections are possible in a room full of 50 people where you allow a many-to-many network? Just math, right? Nothing spiritual. Math is this. 100 million trillion. And we have seen the power of this in the world of profit. There are reasons why, very small companies are worth billions and billions of dollars when the old school factories are like dying out. It's because of this. So we have done it for profit. We have seen many, many examples for profit. We have done it for protest. You look at things even like way back in the early days, Arab Spring. No centralized leader, no money, and all of a sudden you have historic unprecedented change. So we've seen it for profit, we've seen it for protest, but we haven't seen it for compassion. And the reason why compassion is significant is because this is how we're intrinsically wired. So nature is behind you. If you're doing it for profit and protest, you need all this advertising and you need all the Coca-Cola celebrities telling you that this is amazing and you should do this. Buy my product. For compassion needs no marketing. Compassion is contagious. Wasn't that right? Somewhere in one of the classrooms it said kindness is contagious. And that really is true. That really is my experience as well. And if you look at it, I have another photo of me and my wife, we like each other, but the reason why I have this here is research has shown that if a couple that lives together and they're really aligned and in tune, they actually have the same breathing patterns. Research has shown that if you're in a choir and singing, you have no physical contact even, as you are singing, all your heartbeats start to synchronize. Not only that, if you're in the audience watching a play and everyone is totally plugged in, all your heartbeats start to synchronize. And we see that we're actually very social creatures. We are communal beings. We are wired to be with each other. Although our systems often try to alienate us, and there's all kinds of research of how, if you look deep down in your cells, the way our cells are communicating with it, at that micro level, it's actually way more effective than how railways are organized, how our cell networks are working. If you look outside in nature, there's so much science now around trees and how trees are communicating with each other. Trees are not just, this is not just one tree. They're actually in an entire ecosystem. And you see the human networks. This is not Facebook networks. I'm talking about like raw human networks. And they've studied it, it's been remarkable, right? Cancer spreads in networks. Obesity. So if you have me as if my wife thinks I'm really putting on a lot of weight, and if you're friends with me, you're likely to put on weight too. If I start working out, you're likely to start working out if we're friends. Right? These things happen in networks. Smoking and quitting, same thing. If you have friends that smoke, you're more likely to smoke. If you have friends that give up smoking, you're more likely to give up smoking. Same thing with philanthropy. Kindness. It all spreads in networks. So if you do it, we tend to think that, oh my God, I'm just one person, what can I do? I'm handling my small little piece of the pie. Look at the world, it's breaking down. But actually, we're all intrinsically wired by nature's design. So what we do is having a tremendous ripple effect, much more than we even are conscious of. Even having children, right? So if you have children, and we're friends, I'm more likely to have children as well. Similarly with divorces. And so there's a lot of science behind the human network, and it's not even the human network if you look at the internet. When we email each other, we're sending data, right, from one to another. And it doesn't work in an Amazon kind of a way. It doesn't work in the FedEx. I don't know if you have FedEx here. But it doesn't work in like, okay, I received your email, and now I'm going to go deliver it to you. It doesn't work like that. Internet works in a peer-to-peer, many-to-many sort of a way. It goes to your neighbor, from your neighbor to another neighbor, from another neighbor, and on and on and on, and then it reaches that person. You say, how is that reliable? But if you actually look at the internet, you say, wow, that's actually way more reliable than one central agency controlling everything. And this is what all our apps, the whole foundation of what we are doing is based on this distributed many-to-many organizing. And so I think the question, as you imagine a classroom, if you look at it from a teacher-student perspective, if a teacher is not a learner, if a student is not a teacher, I mean, all the different combinations of that, if we're not in a symbiotic relationship, we have a centralized model. And that's great, 50 connections, that serves its value in the world, but it's not nearly as effective as a decentralized model, and far from a distributed model. If relationships are the goal, you can see how many strands do you have in that distributed model. And that's what you want to start to go towards. And there are so many examples of putting this into practice in the world of education. This is Mary Gordon. I don't know how many of you guys have heard of Mary Gordon. How many people know? No, you don't know. Oh, well, we have one person. Mary did something remarkable. At her school in Canada, they had a lot of bullying. So they were spending lots of money. Countries spend hundreds of billions of dollars to try to counteract bullying. She did something that was remarkable and simple and took no money and was very effective. And she then applied it in 400 schools. Now she's working on doing it in America, and hopefully it spreads all over the place. What she did is she would get a classroom together, bring them all in, and sit in a circle. And in the center of a circle, she would ask a volunteer, a new mother, and say, okay, you're a new mom, will you bring your young toddler into our classroom? And so they would get around in a circle, and the toddler would be in the middle, and they have a simple question they ask. They say, what is the toddler thinking? Obviously, there's no right answer. But in that simple process of saying, oh, what is the toddler thinking? You start to rewire your brains. Over a few months, you start to engage with each other in a much deeper way. You start to engage with yourself in a deeper way, and bullying rates in the school start to go down. But what did Mary do? She wasn't a teacher in that traditional sense of like, now I'm going to teach you. She actually allowed the natural tendencies of all these folks to come in and arise. So she wasn't a top-down sort of a teacher. She was more of a many-to-many. So she wasn't a traditional leader. She was more of a ladder, holding the whole, looking at the relationships in between, looking at the relationship of each child to their own compassion. And it's a very different model of engagement. So as I get to the end here, we tend to think that values are taught, that it's based on curriculum. And some of it may be true. You do need some curriculum around it. But that's actually not what ends up being the most powerful thing. Values, the deepest values are not taught. And I bet if we had a circle and we asked, and I've done this, where you say, well, tell us of your favorite teacher that has inspired you. Nobody would talk about a curriculum. They would talk about, we were in India once, and this woman shared this beautiful story. She was a school principal, and she says, I ran into a student I had in 4th grade. Now she's a mom, and she brought her young one, and they were shopping. I ran into them. She looks at me, and she says, oh, ma'am, I remember you. How are you doing? They chatted. And then this girl, who was a 4th grade student of the principal, is introducing the principal to her young daughter. And you know what she says? This was the teacher that brought watermelon in our classroom because she loved us so much. She didn't say she taught me math, or she taught me this, or this was the curriculum, or this is how I used that to get ahead in the world. It became about watermelon. So we all know that. We can go around the circle and we would all hear those stories repeatedly, but I think the main principle here is the values aren't taught, they are caught. Right? So, should I tell you a story? Yeah. Teachers love stories, right? Okay, I have a couple more slides. Okay, I'll tell you the story too. It's beautiful. This is about Gandhi. So Gandhi used to go, classroom to classroom, village to village, people to people. He wasn't particularly interested in big. He was more interested in the deeper. And of course, he revolutionized India, and of course, you can say in the world. But at some point, he walks into a classroom. And Gandhi, father of a nation, at that time 350 million people, and he's out there, he's sharing what he's sharing, and there's a 17-year-old, raises his hand, and he says, what you're talking about is utopia. That is not practical, And so he starts firing into Gandhi. And the school principals and all, they're like, we need to get this kid quiet, And it's like, what? He's making the school look bad, like, who is the 17-year-old arguing with the father of a nation? But Gandhi, being Gandhi, says, no, I want to hear your point. Yeah, why don't you share? And so he starts speaking, and Gandhi's listening. And at some point he says, well, what would you recommend? How would you think? And he says, well, I've read Das Kapital, and I think we should have this kind of worldview. So he even had answers for all of that. And at the end, Gandhi realizes that in that short exchange, he's not going to be able to transform him, or it's not going to change him either. And so he looks at this kid, the 17-year-old, this father of a nation, this person with incredible power, right, and potential. He looks at that kid and he says, well, just as I permit you to think what you want to think, would you kindly permit me to think what I think, to believe in what I believe in? And the kid was so transformed that he ended up 6 months later. He said yes in that moment, and he quieted down. But he's like, who is this man that is treating me with the same level of respect that he would treat a world leader? And he was so touched by Gandhi's humility that 6 months later, he ends up moving to Gandhi's ashram, and this kid ended up dedicating his whole life to service. And there are so many such stories of people like Gandhi that are never going to be told. You can watch Attenborough's film and be inspired by Gandhi, the most amazing guy. I could never be like him. But actually, he came from this space of deep compassion. He came from the space of deep humility. He came from this space of realizing that if I want to change the world, it's not changed by this kind of force, it's changed by who I am. And I'm bringing who I am to every single moment. This is another teacher who is one of my heroes, Sister Lucy. Sister Lucy was recently with us. And Sister Lucy is the kind of teacher that one has to have a lot of inner resources to be like Sister Lucy. She takes any kid that is left out on the street, any kid that comes her way, that has absolutely nothing, like I'm talking a newborn child that people will leave next to a trash can. She will pick them up. Last time I was with her, she told me a story of how this one woman was completely abused by a whole group of men, and she was left out on the streets, and she was completely out of her senses, and she had no clothes on. And Sister Lucy takes one of her shawls and brings her in, puts her in her car and brings her to one of the homes. She has 1,500 kids. She affects tens of thousands of kids on a day-to-day basis. If you ask her, you said, look, Sister Lucy, there is no way, there's so many problems in the world, there is no way that you can hold all those kids. And she says, my dear, if God, she has this faith in God, you know, and she says, if God shows me a need, my job is to take it in and trust that another door will open somewhere, somehow. Like, this is Sister Lucy. Like, it's kind of remarkable. These are exceptional people. Like Mother Teresa, you know, at some point, somebody asked Mother Teresa, she's running so many centers around the world, somebody asked Mother Teresa, hey, what's your fundraising strategy? And because, you know, she's like a Fortune 500 CEO, if you look at it from a material lens. So what's your fundraising strategy? And you know what Mother Teresa says? True story. She says, my dear, I just pray. And you're like, oh, that's not sustainable, that's so foo-foo, you know? And you're like, what? Prayer? Like, how can you run 700 centers around the world? But there's a technology there that these people seem to tap into. So Sister Lucy, though, that's not my point here. This is just the amazingness of Sister Lucy. This is why you know, you would be filled up even if she was here. You should get her here some day. So Sister Lucy has this incredible story. She says, I never quit on a child. You can imagine that the kinds of children that she's bringing in off the streets, orphans, and all kinds of damaged situations, so much trauma, they're not going to sit in a classroom in the same way that privileged students do, or even everyday students do. Right? It's a lot. It's very stressful. But Sister Lucy says, I never give up on a child, because I don't want to be given up myself. And she says very clearly that we teach who we are. And so she gave me this example. She gave us, where she was speaking at one of our events, and she gave us this incredible story of how this, and it had just happened that month. And she says there was this young kid who was like, you know, very troubled background, and he comes into one of their schools, and they've been holding him and being patient, being, you know, and he was, I guess, in middle school. I forget the exact age. And one day he comes out from playing, and they all live in a shared home, very simple headquarters, and then they have, you know, they have the cooks who cook for them and all kinds of things. So he comes home one day, and he says, I'm really hungry. And he opens the fridge. You're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to wait for your food to be served. And he opens the fridge, and guess what he sees? A cake. And he's like, oh my God, my lucky day, you know. It happened to be one of the kids' birthdays, and so they had made a cake for everyone to share, but he's so hungry, he eats half of the cake. And so the chefs and the local caretakers, they come in and they're like, you know, they're just so upset, and they just start yelling at him, and they tell him, look, you can't do this, you know, what do you think this is? Do you think that's caring? Do you think that's compassion? All these things. And you know what this kid does? He goes and he slaps with the chef. And then there was a huge revolt. Now, of course, they can't strike back, right, at the kid. Huge revolt in all the staff. They said, look, we have had it. We've had it with Sister Lucy's compassion. We've had it with this kid. If this kid is allowed to stay, we're all going to quit. So the call goes to Sister Lucy. And Sister Lucy gets the call. She ends up coming there, all this stuff. And they said, we're all going to, and it's very hard to find staff for these kinds of situations. But Sister Lucy's a very principled person. She says, I will never give up on a child. If you want to give up, and if you all want to leave, then go ahead. And she says, I want to go speak to the kid. So they meet. They have this connection at a train station, incidentally. And Sister Lucy, first thing, this is how she disciplines everybody. She looks at them, and she says, I want you to know I love you. She hugs this kid and says, I want you to know I love you, at the train station. The kid starts crying. But now, fast forward many years, Sister Lucy is at our house telling us the story, and she says, this kid grew up, went to college, got a job in the Army, and had his first paycheck. And he wanted to donate that entire paycheck to Maher, their organization. And so he comes to offer this with great humility. And as he's offering this, he speaks to all the children. And he retells that story of him being greedy with the cake, him being violent with his actions. But then he says, that I was so upset, and I had decided that I'm going to go out of this place, I'm going to join a terrorist group, I'm going to get a bunch of guns, and I'm going to shoot all these people down. And he says, the reason why I didn't do it was because this woman named Sister Lucy came to see me, and at a train station, she gave me a big hug and said, I want you to know I love you. And he says to all those kids that don't ever underestimate the power of love. Don't ever underestimate the power of small acts of kindness. And the reason why Sister Lucy is effective is not because of the grand things she does, is because she is being the change she wishes to see. She understands that values are not taught, you have to actually be that change. And so the question for all of us today, later on in the workshops, and even tomorrow, is, how can we nurture not just compassion on the outside, not just look at you and say, you need to be more compassionate, but actually even within us. And how do we start to look within us in a very deep way and outside, not in a manufacturing way, but in a gardening sort of way? That the time will ripen for different people at different times, different students at different times in different ways. And there are so many examples of the kinds of interventions. You'll hear about lots of them. But one of my favorite ones, and I'm so happy, we have this thing called a smile card. It says, you do a small act of kindness and you leave a smile card behind. Tells the person, you don't know who did this, but you can pay it forward. You can't pay back, but you can pay it forward. Right? And I'm so happy that there's actually a Romanian one. We don't have that many, but maybe by tomorrow we will. And that's a beautiful thing. Kindness, it turns out, is a muscle. The more you practice it, the more you have, the more capacity you have to be kind. And not just kind in small acts, but kind in courageous ways. Kind in ways of forgiveness. Kind in ways of going into deep polarity and building a bridge. There's so many expressions of kindness. Then we have a smile deck, which unfortunately I've had so many places I've run out of all my. I usually never run out of smile cards, but I have this time. But you'll get Romanian ones. But we have a smile deck where each one has a unique kindness idea. So you shuffle up the deck and you say, and you can create one here locally. You can shuffle up the deck and you pick a random card. Right? You guys all look young here, so you can pick a random card, go out, do it, come back, and say, share your experience. And you'd be amazed. You're like, oh, I was with a kid one time, he says, I'm going to go out and do an act of kindness. So he goes and gets his favorite cake, and he goes out on the street, he looks at a person who doesn't have any food, and he says, I want to give you my favorite cake. And that homeless man looks at him and says, no, I don't want it. He says, why not? It's my favorite. I just want to make your day. He says, I don't trust you. Because there have been so many kids that have come on the streets and actually pranked us. They'll put drugs in this thing. They'll do all this stuff. So now this kid has to go back and he says, oh, I thought you told me kindness is supposed to feel good. But people rejected my kindness. How are you going to process that? And that's real life stuff that you have to deal with. So you'd be amazed at how, not in a top-down way, but in a growing sort of a way, you can nudge all these different capacities within us. And it takes, we have a 21-day kindness challenge. I think I actually have a, so yeah, there's so many stories. I'll skip this for now. But we do this thing called the 21-day kindness challenge. Or this is a gratitude challenge, and there's a reverence challenge, and a mindfulness challenge, and technology challenge. There's all kinds of challenges, right? And every day you get one idea, and everyone does the same idea. And you share stories about it, and you would be amazed that I may be like, okay, I've done this 3 days, no more. But then I read your idea, and I'm like, okay, I want to do it. Okay, I'll do it on day 4. And then day 6, you get lazy, and you read my idea, and that's powerful. And so this communal way of growing our muscles ends up being very powerful. And so here's a story about it. So we did this with our interns. We have these summer internships. And we first did it with these guys. We would do a 30-day challenge. And it's really powerful, right? They start to do all these things that you wouldn't imagine. But the story I want to share is with this woman, with this young girl. She was 19 at the time. And she comes in, she says every day they would do an act of kindness, and she'd come back and they would tell us the stories. And so it was like, I think, day 23. Initially, you do what you know, right? The first trimester, first 10 days. Then the second 10 days, you kind of have to rewire your brain and think of new ideas. And it's almost like when you have no path in your brain, you're actually creating a new neural pathway. And once you create that path in stressful situations, you will have access to that path, and you will take that path. And so it's really powerful. In the second sort of 10 days, the second trimester, people start doing, like kids start doing really creative things. And then in the third is when it gets really magical. The last segment is where now they have all this new capacity. Where are they going to use this? And it starts to flow, not where you want it to go. You should be kind in this way or this way. It starts to flow where it needs to go for their own self, and they know exactly where it needs to go. It's the most amazing thing. I've seen it with so many people in so many different contexts. It's really powerful. So this young woman says on day 23, she says, I decided I'm going to be kind to myself. And we thought, kind to myself, okay, is she going to get ice cream or what? You know, I don't know, what is kindness to yourself, right? So she then tells us this most remarkable story of how she was a 9-year-old sitting in the back seat, mom and dad in the front, and the car gets in an accident. Mom passes away. And she says, I had never been able to visit my mom's funeral site by myself. And today, for the first time, I said, I'm going to go there. I can do this. And she says, I reconnected with my roots in a way that I didn't even know I was disconnected. And it happened, we didn't even know about her background. We didn't even know about her mom. And it was actually even a more complex story because mom and dad were struggling with each other. And so here, you know, we were like, wow, how did she figure out how to heal herself? But this is the power of compassion, right? That we know, we have that intelligence baked into us. So a lot of people, and here's a 21-day kindness diary. Maybe you can, I only have a couple, but you can look at this and maybe create. So this is, we have an online version of it, but this is really beautiful, and maybe you can create a Romanian one, where you have the idea here, and at the end of the day, you reflect on it and you write down. And as you write down, you're actually processing, and there's a lot of research on journaling and how that ends up being very powerful. And by the end, you have a little notebook for 21 days about your acts of kindness, about your inner capacity and your relationship to that inner capacity. And so a lot of people look at this and you say, wow, kindness grows in its own time, different time for different people. That's really slow. I want to change my school tomorrow. I want to change the world tomorrow. Right? I want to have a plan. I want to scale this up right away. And to them, I give this metaphor. This is actual bridge in India, in the state of Meghalaya, where they have a lot of rain. So across this river, they've tried to put all kinds of bridges. Right? They've put cement bridges, they've tried all different kinds of material, everything collapses. The only thing that has sustained itself, the only thing that has created this resilient solution has been what they call a living bridge, which is this. So every generation here knows that this is roots of this tree connecting to the roots of this tree. So every generation knows that what they have to do is take this tiny root, connect it with the next root. That's all your job is, because it's not going to grow overnight. It's going to take another generation to go from here to here. It's going to take another generation to go to here. And it takes hundreds of generations to get this one living bridge. And it completely challenges our dominant paradigm thinking of wanting everything now, wanting everything fast, wanting the quick feedback loop, feeling the dopamine and the serotonin and the oxytocin and the hormone releases, like I did my kind act, why am I not feeling good, right? Like we do all of that. But this is a very different story. This is about unpacking so many stories, creating an entirely different story of patience, of tolerance. Instead of a fast story, instead of doing an act of kindness, taking a selfie and putting it, nothing wrong with that for those that do that. It's good, you should spread kindness. But you're taking a selfie, putting it up online, and then forgetting about it. Right? This is not a quick feedback loop. What are the slow stories that we're living into? We're all slow stories. We're not fast stories at our core. And so what are those slow stories and how do we tap into that? What is our relationship to compassion? How do we grow that compassion in ourselves and in other people? Oh, okay. Should I show you one? Okay, I'll show you one last video. It has a tune from my mother tongue, which you don't need to understand, but it's beautiful. And this is a short clip, and then maybe we'll do, if we have time, maybe we'll do some Q&A. 57 minutes. I've got 3 more minutes, so we can meditate. No, here we go. Get some money and he's looking to see what he's going to buy. We have time for a couple questions. Maybe we do. So just a couple questions, and then tomorrow we'll share maybe a little bit more about society at large. But let me go back to this thing. Any thoughts, reflections, challenges? All good. And English is preferred.
That's, yeah, I can hear myself. So first of all, I want to express gratitude for having you here and for knowing about this event. And my question to you, you mentioned you come from Silicon Valley, and obviously your roots are in India.
Yeah.
If you think of different cultures that you met, can you explain a little bit on what would be the difference in reaction to kindness and compassion, in different cultures?
Yeah. You know, there's a tendency to think that people who have are more generous. There's a tendency to frame, especially as a design principle in our systems, this is a blind spot of our systems, is that we frame generosity as a luxury sport. Then we look at it and say, oh, only when you have, you do all this. My wife and I, in 2005, we got rid of everything we had, and this is a much longer story, but in brief, we said we want to become better people. Because ultimately, you not only teach who you are, you parent who you are, but you design who you are. And so in 2005, we sold everything we had, and we said, if kindness is so great, let's test it out. So we put all our boxes, a few things that we had at my parents' house. We took a one-way ticket to India. Gandhi was a big inspiration. We went to the Gandhi ashram, and we said, we're going to walk south. We're going to eat whatever food is offered. We're going to sleep wherever place is offered. So imagine me taking all your cell phones and your wallets, and I said, all right, I'm going to drop you off in, say, Turkey, and I'll see you in a year. And you were like, how will I survive? How have you survived in your mother's womb? Did you have a 5-year plan? No, you didn't, you know? And so we tested this out, and it was amazing, and it was remarkable. And one of the huge insights was that whenever we would go to a place and people have a lot, immediately they look at us skeptically. They would look and say, what are you going to take from my house? All right, is it safe? Is it, why are you doing this? Oh, you're educated. Shouldn't you be doing this? Shouldn't you be doing that? Those people who had the least opened their homes and their hearts. We have had food where people borrowed food to feed us. I cannot have a single meal without feeling gratitude. Once you have had repeated numbers of those meals where people look at you and they say, wow, guest is God, right? Guest is divinity. I don't know who you are. I don't know if we'll ever meet again, but in this moment, I want it to be a generous moment. I want it to be a moment of deep connection. And I'm going to manifest that through whatever little means I have. And these are people that can't even afford vegetables. They can't afford dairy. And they would go and borrow some food and give us food. And you're like thinking, should I even accept this food? But then you would be dishonoring their generosity. And you're like, wow. And so yes, the context, there is the country context. There's also the socioeconomic context. But a lot of these things that we have baked in assumptions actually turn the flip on their heads. That if you actually want to be, well, you know, after that experience for so long in India, when you live like that, it's like, well, first of all, my ego just took a beating every single day because we're so wired in a very different way. We want, you feed me today, and I'm like, oh, that's great, and we have this really deep bond, and then I want to hold on to you. But on a pilgrimage, everything's constantly changing. Tomorrow, a different home. Maybe people are mean to you. Maybe nobody approaches you. And your connection, you're not asking for things. You're actually doing small acts of kindness and trusting that those kind acts will lead to relationships. And some of those relationships, purely out of gratitude, will overflow. And they'll be like, oh, who's feeding you? Oh, where are you sleeping? And you'd be amazed how people do that. And so having lived in that kind of a context for a short but a significant period of my life, I would say it upended so many of my beliefs about what generosity is, how generosity can play itself out, what is the relationship to context. Although this was all in India, but you have so many different contexts, right? And you have small cities and big cities and rich people and not so rich poor people and farmers and, you know. So yes, and one of my friends did this on a bicycle. And he would go out, he did a slightly different way. He's done 40,000 kilometers on his bicycle, and he would knock on doors. And he would say, you know, would you let me pitch a tent in your front yard? And he draws very interesting conclusions. He's done it in, I think, over a dozen countries. He's from China. And he says, you know, in the US, maybe about 40% of the people let me pitch a tent. His was different than ours. He's just asking, you have space outside, can I just pitch a tent? And he says, in the UK, a little bit higher, but not that much. The country where I had the best response was Iran. And he says, 100%. I didn't even have to ask. Like everyone looks at him and says, oh, you know, how can we help? How can we serve you? So there's a lot of these. I mean, it's a complex question. I don't know how to soundbite it, but I would just say that yes, there are cultural differences. There are systemic influences. There are inner transformation related influences to our behavior. And all of those come together in different ways in different places. And I'm sure Romania has its own unique response. But can each one of them be geared towards greater compassion? I think absolutely. And do we have another choice? No. Because we're going to create polarities otherwise. Right? We have to go from breaking and building barriers to building bridges. And I think compassion is the inner resource that lets you do that. And if we don't do that, we're going to be completely isolated and disconnected. And I worry a lot about Silicon Valley, where I'm from, where people are doing it in such subversive ways that we think we're just using our cell phones, but they've actually studied, you know, what gets released in your brain, and we're addicted to this. So the dopamine and the serotonin and the oxytocin and the hormones that are released, it's what gets you a gambling high. Right? It's what gets you an alcohol high. And we're exposing, it's like opening up our whole bar to a 4-year-old. It is not responsible, but we don't even know that it's doing that, except a bunch of people in the Silicon Valley who are making hundreds of billions of dollars doing this. And we're all just like, oh, I think it's connecting me. And then 15, 20 years later, you're like, oh, actually it's disconnecting us. And you say, oh, what's going on? The co-founder of Facebook is telling us this. Right? So Mark Zuckerberg is not, but the other co-founder is telling us very openly that, yeah, I would never let my kids on Facebook. Because we manipulated the whole game. We're looking at your neuroscience that you're not even aware of, and we're getting you on this rat race. So there's a lot of challenges. We can't afford to not be compassionate. Compassion has a context, it's very contextual. I would say not just at a country level, not just at a socioeconomic level, but even in like that moment to moment. Like what does that kid want in that moment? And that's why who we are is so critical to raising compassion quotient. We have to be kind ourselves, otherwise we're not going to be tuned in to what is emerging in front of us. Do I have a question here? Up here? Oh, sure. No, men first too. It's all good. We live in an equal world now.
Thank you. So my question is, you talked about technology, and the technology is something that is not going to stop. And the kids, unfortunately, are using it, and the parents and the professors have no word to say. If you stop the kids to use technology, you are a bad guy, for example.
Yeah.
So do you think that in the future we can combine technology with ethics and to learn some kind of empathy through the content and through the context? I think that this would be a change, because Facebook said that it's actually connecting people, but actually it's disconnecting people. And on Facebook everything is actually fake. And we cannot learn the kids to be fake. We have to learn the kids to be real and to study things that are real.
Yeah.
Right? So do you think that in the future technology can help and bring some ethics?
I hope so. I'm from the camp of optimism, and I'm involved in many such events. We're actually creating this thing. There are those who will say technology is doomed and we shouldn't do it. I'm not from that camp. I think it's a tool, and you can use it in so many different ways. But I think we need to design at that level. And so I actually have a slide way at the end. Oh, there it is. That, we design who we are, essentially, is what I've been saying all along. And so I taught a course at UC Berkeley with all these PhD students and grad students at UC Berkeley. And these are like cream of the crop. And we talked about values, and none of them had processed that. So usually you're just thinking, oh, I graduate and then I get a really fancy job, I sit in a corner and I do this small thing and I don't know what effect it has in the world. And I think we need to kind of change that. We need to have people think, make them more aware, so they can actually go and say, is this really what I want to be doing in the world? And I see a lot of hope, although there's many reasons to not be hopeful, because this is a giant machine. The reason why I see hope is because this is nature-backed. It's not venture-funded, it's nature-funded, because we are wired to be compassionate. So I can go into any setting and talk about compassion, and you don't need to know how famous I am, or how not famous I am, or how much science I have, or how many degrees, or how many publications. Who cares? Do you beat to the, go in and just try to connect at the level of heart. I was on a plane once with this guy who was the head of, this is recorded, all right, okay, I'm not going to say what he was the head of. So it was big person, and this was a private plane, so he stuck with me. And I was speaking at a commencement address. I was giving a commencement address at a school, and so he had to escort me from this city to another. And he's just not happy. He's like, oh, these people, he didn't want anything to do with me. But he was stuck, and I was stuck with him too. So we were both like trying to engage. And I was like, there's always a heart. This Indian saint said a very beautiful thing. He says, when you walk into a room, you can walk in through you can try to break a wall and come into a room. That's going to be pretty hard. You can break a window and come in, or you can just open the door. And the door is the human heart. And so I always go into these situations and I say, okay, I know there's a heart somewhere here, you know, because this is nature back. You may not remember, but when you were 14, you wanted to go and, you know, help somebody open the door. It's wired. So I'm like, it's a call to my creativity. I say, man, come on, think, man. You've done all this stuff. Bring out this card, that card, some combination. And so I slowly start to soften him a little bit, you know. And I said, you know what we should do is when we get off the plane, and there was like another security thing that we had to go through. I said, you look at that security guard. He's going to have a name tag. And the name tag is going to be his last name. Look him in the eye and say, sir, what's your first name? And say thank you with his first name. And all of a sudden, he's like, and we had sufficient enough bond where he's willing to try this. But when you hear it, like all of you have heard this, but this is going to have a mediocre effect. If you actually go in, he's looking at this guy. Usually, a person with that kind of power looks at him and says, you're in my way, means to an end, right? This is just something I have to go through and I'm going through it. And all of those people fall into that line saying, sorry, I'm in your way. You know, you're more important, you go there. All of a sudden, he goes and he says, sir, what's your first name? And the tides change. And you can feel the energy of it, right? And not only that, then he starts, but then he says, thank you. What, Andre? Andre is a common name here, yeah? He says, thank you, Andre. And all of a sudden, the energy between them and that walk from there to the baggage claim, oh my God, this guy was feeling so high, and he's like, you know, you're really onto something with this kindness, you know? And it wasn't me, it was because I had tried, and it failed, but it was the experience of it, because he remembered that, oh yeah, like we are, you know, we are wired to be kind. So how do we go into these situations? So I'm hopeful, because nature has wired us this way, but I think it's a call to our creativity to go into any setting, any student, any situation, and have a patient timeline. Right? This is a story where I was able to turn it around in a short period of time. But what if it took 3 generations? Would I still do the same thing? I would. Because I'm not in it for the short-term change. No one's asking me. If anyone who asks me, hey, what impact have you had in the world? I'm like, I don't know, I'm impacting you right now. That's it. And I have created a life where I don't respond to those kinds of questions, and I don't need to, because we operate outside of that context. And so there is this hope. I have this hope because of nature, not because of the dominant paradigm. Thank you.
Thank you very much for everything so far. Thank you. I believe we live in a state of shared.
Speak in and live.
I believe we live in a shared value mindset society.
Yes.
And what we talk about here, including compassion, kindness, compassion, tolerance, whatever is features of a stakeholder value mindset. I somehow created with some colleagues a community to try to work towards that and build in school and help schools, like business community involved, to try to help schools get compassion, kindness training of some kind.
Yeah.
We are at the beginning of this road, and we already talked. Others try scale it. What has been from your experience? Because if you look at the Silicon Valley and not Western society, this mindset and apparently nice and good positive impact behind is still driven by greed. Again, profits are fine.
Yeah.
Or as long as they create stakeholder value or shareholder value.
Yeah.
And I'm not the profits are still good because they are not low. However, what has been your experience? What have been the challenges for having this compassion, kindness, tolerance training in schools? And in my opinion, that's the only way to change the current society, which is sort of fucked up and from this.
We don't have any kids here. Oh, we do just. But he's okay. He's F-word resilient.
So again, from this perspective, I think it's heading in the right direction. You know, to put it in the right direction, right? Direction, I would say.
Yeah.
We need those things in schools. What has been the challenge with students in various countries to implement it?
Yeah. So I would say that there's a spectrum of. Did somebody say hello? No. I would say there's a spectrum. On one side, you just have sort of this agreed mindset, one bottom line. Then you have people that are trying to do multiple bottom lines. And then you have people that are thinking out of the box, and you say, hey, let's just like blow this box open. And then you have people that are like way out of the box that you don't know. So I think there's a spectrum, and you need everybody to be where they are in the spectrum with this heart, to be a Trojan horse of love. Because even when I was just in Frankfurt a couple of days ago, and I was talking to all these folks, and you know, there's purpose is like a big buzzword in the business world, but then just as you had greenwashing, you have purpose washing, and you kind of slap this thing on, and underneath it, you're still trying to, you know, it's like Coca-Cola saying happiness. It's not really happiness, you know. So how do we start to hold all of this? And you say, you go to somebody in Coca-Cola and say, look, shine your light. Right? Be a Trojan horse of love. Remember that we design who we are. So within the constraints, you work with these, you know, with these different possibilities. It's like a guitar string, right? The way I think about it is if it's too tight, it's going to pop. If it's too loose, it's not going to make any music. So we're constantly in these creative constraints. So you have to work in that. In education, you say, hey, what has worked and how can we create this? I think some of the things that people are experimenting with, there is, you know, CBCT, that one of my friends at Emory is running compassion-based cognitive training. So you can actually, there's so much research on how you can grow in compassion in a systematic, methodical way. I think there's also a need for more metrics. And metrics is a tricky word when you try to talk about this end of the spectrum, because people will say compassion can't be measured. But I was in Bhutan with people who created gross national happiness. And they are saying GDP is not a good metric. So what is gross national happiness, and how do we start to grow? Because if you don't have metrics, you can't have a conversation because you don't have the vocabulary. And so if you're totally on the ground, like I am, it's fine. If you're on the streets of India and you're talking to that person who has nothing, you don't need any, you're feeling it, he's feeling it. But if I'm enacting policy and I have so many other people who may care about this or who may not, I actually need a vocabulary. And metrics start to create that vocabulary so that you can start to create you know, different solutions. I served on Obama's Council on Poverty and Inequality, and you know, these are hard questions that we were tackling of how do you, the limitations of metrics, and also the possibilities of metrics. So how do you start to hold some of that in education? You know, like at the end of the day, how can you make sure that cell is on par with STEM? Like, what does that look like? And you know, what are the different metrics? What is the vocabulary through which we have that conversation? How do we measure to see if it's being effective? Because maybe it's not. It's not just lip service, right? The Julio Diaz's of the world are real, alive, and well, but are we creating the Julios of the world? And then holding their, you know, much more complex question of, well, I can't measure. I mean, how do I know that you're the Julio of the world? Maybe you turn into the Julio, I just provided the door here. That maybe you turn into a Julio 20 years later. So I think it's complex. But I think there's a lot of reason for optimism, particularly for me, around this new neuroscience that is changing the conversation. We don't have the metrics yet. We have some. We have many frameworks. But I think there's a lot of new neuroscience that is making it very clear that it's just, you know, this is just a design upgrade. You know, it took us 5,000 years to put wheels on bags. Such a simple thing. We're like, why didn't we think of that? You know? And so similarly, I think we're going to get a design upgrade, and we're like, oh, these barriers, that's not the best way to go. You know, like bees don't organize like that, ants don't organize like that, nature is not organized like that, and it's been far more resilient for far longer than human life. So what is the design upgrade? You know, I think this is a challenge, it's an opportunity, but I don't think it's easy. So, yes, thank you. One last question, and then I know that we've got so many great things for you, so I don't want to take up all the time.
Thank you. And I'm just curious, because we're wired for kindness, and then we have society, family, all of different contexts that start to wire us as well. So in the story that you shared with the kid who wanted to give his favorite cake to
Yeah.
the homeless man, and the homeless man refused and said, no, I don't trust you, what would you have answered that kid? Or what would you answer a kid who says, when we tell them, let's send the love and kindness thoughts to people that we don't know, but not to the bad people? We don't want to send love and kindness to bad people. What would you answer?
So in theory, I don't think there's it would be contextual. But in principle, I would tell you that I treat adults the same way as I would treat kids. As channels of compassion, we all have the same potential. Now, as a child, I may not be able to articulate it in the same way. I may not have the same mental constructs, but you may actually be a greater channel for that compassion. So I don't undermine that by physical age, that you have greater or lesser propensity towards compassion. So that's like the first thing. And with that context, I would go to a child, and you can imagine this has come up many times. I'm sure you could go out in Romania, everyone do an act of kindness outside. You're going to get a whole range of different options. You're going to be like, I'm never going to do this again. Why should I, you know? We run this experiment, maybe tomorrow I'll talk about it, where it's called Karma Kitchen, where you walk into a restaurant and your check reads 0. Not because it's free, but because someone before you has paid for you and you are trusted to pay forward for people after you. And you would be amazed at how confusing it is for people to trust and love. You would be amazed at how confusing it is for a volunteer waiter. Because I'm serving you fully out of love, and all of a sudden, I'm like, oh, I wonder what they left in the envelope. And that becomes a thing for me. Like all these different nuances, you know, start to really come into play. So, yeah, at some point, I think you have to unpack a lot of this. So a child, when he comes up to me with that context, that he is capable of it as much as you, I would ask him, I said, all right, you got rejected. What are you going to do? Because if you say no, that now I think the world is a terrible place. You create that world. Is that the world you want to live in? Or are you going to step up and say, in this context of mistrust, in this context of so many barriers, I am going to awaken my revolutionary heart. I'm going to respond to even negativity with great love. What are you going to do? I'm not going to give you an answer. You decide. Because I have faith in them that they will actually, if you provide the right context, so many of them will say, you know what? If I got rejected, that means other people will get rejected. That means we create that kind of world. And I know how it feels to be rejected in the classroom. It's everywhere. So, you know, I need to actually step up into that greater love. I would leave the question with them. And you would be amazed how so many people will say, I want to step up into that revolutionary spirit. I want to create more love. So I would go there, and I would trust in that process, even though it's not right away. Maybe that person says, no, you know, it's overwhelming. Then maybe they're not meant to be the Julio Diaz in that world, and that's fine. They are on that spectrum, wherever they are. So I think it takes all of us to sort of say yes to love in so many different ways. So may 1,000 flowers bloom. Thank you so very much.
I just wanted to let you know how the rest of the day goes. So we will have a coffee break now for 30 minutes. So it's 5 to 12. And then it would very much help us if you could just now put your hand up so we can see how many people will join the workshops. So we see if we will need one room or two. So if you could please put your hand up if you participate in workshops. The workshops, so maybe some of you don't know what it's about, so I should give you a little brief. What we are going to do is we are going to go deeper into this talk about compassion, and we are going to talk about some of the stress factors that might prevent us from having more compassion for ourselves or for those around you. And this is going to be very practical. We have our trainers from school, and we are going to share our experience with children in school, but also as parents. So after the coffee break, we will meet back here up where you have the registration, so we can divide in these two groups. Thank you. Take care of ourselves. You're in a good place. Like we say to our kids in school, where we talk about emotions, and they are related to different colors. And I'm not going to go into it, but the green zone is where they feel safe and where they feel relaxed and where they can focus. So now, because you had lunch and your that need at least is satisfied, we're hoping to have you in the green zone here with us and to have your attention. And I will invite on stage NIPUN, who you already know, and also Richard Ioannidis, which is the founder of our Verita Foundation and Verita School. And we give them a round of applause.
How was lunch? Is Nichols in the house? Nichols, you're out somewhere here? Well, you have to thank the chefs and the waiters. And they're from our school, so they cooked all night last night. I always feel it's so much more authentic to have a conversation, a dialogue with you together, and just sort of dance and see where it goes. We have a few questions here that we've collected from your feedback, that some questions we'd like to go over. But before we go into the written questions, I'd like to kind of open it up and see what's arisen within you during the workshops that transpired, or during the conversation, the talk, or the conversation you had in the morning with NIPUN, and just see what's out there before we just kind of just start talking. I'd like to get your vibe. What's coming up for you? What questions are coming? What was your intention to come here today? You could have been anywhere today. You decided to be here. What is your intention? What are you looking for in your own hearts? What are the burning questions for you?
Hello.
Hi.
I'm Marina, and I came here because I saw an ad on Facebook. A friend of mine posted it, and I'm really grateful to be here, and I really resonate with what's going on here and with all the people being here. Especially as I talk to you. And regarding the workshops, what I saw there and the feeling is that we need to shift from what we do and what we have to what we are. And the shift to compassion is to be done by each and every one of us. From a deep connection to our inner self, and through that we should be able to spread it all over us, all over the system among us, the groups that we are in. That would be my conclusion.
That's beautiful. Who we are. I mean, I think in modern society, and you can jump in whenever you like, it's just, there's so many distractions and it's so busy. And, you know, life can be really tough. And, you know, I speak to so many parents and the community, and it can feel very overwhelming sometimes. And we all live with our anxieties and our fears and our worries and our feeling inadequate and our imperfections, and we're struggling with that every day. And when you walk in the streets, you don't realize that there's a lot of vulnerability. It's hard to be a human sometimes, you know. And we come into this world and there's a lot we have to face. And I think sometimes when we talk about compassion, maybe in the very beginning when I started to work with it, it felt like just another thing I have to add to my plate. It almost felt like I'm just trying to keep my head over the water, and it's like I'm struggling with so many other things. Where do I find the energy to, okay, take this extra thing? You know, that's like one of the questions here is how do I fill my cup, or maybe my cup is too full. How do I, deal with it? And so you brought up at the end, I think you kind of hinted to it, I think when we connect with ourselves and when we feel safe with ourselves and when we're really willing to be perfectly okay with our humanness and all the imperfections that come with that, and there's a resting there. It's almost like, that the heart opens by itself, and then there's a natural compassion there. And I think in many ways our nervous system is so hyperactivated. We're having all these thousands of thoughts and things and judgments and worries, and we're just human doings, like almost walking heads. We have no contact physically with this part here. I mean, literally, like physically, how often do we come down to be present in our bodies? And so, I think in many ways it goes hand in hand to reconnect with that compassion. I think it's reconnecting with your heart. And to reconnect with your heart, you have to feel good about who you are, feel connected, find well-being. How do we work with this crazy mind we have sometimes that can have this negative chatter and these emotions that come up and sway us and take us in different directions, and we feel sort of very vulnerable with those emotions. And so, I think if we can start to better understand that process and connect with that, then naturally when we're in a place of, as Leela said, the green zone, when we talk about with our kids, then it's so much more spacious to, then compassion is just a natural manifestation.
There was a beautiful story actually over lunch. A bunch of us were chatting, and I was reminded of one of my sort of, not a formal mentor, but somebody that I was inspired by for many years. And he revolutionized the face of sanitation in India. And so he received the highest awards, and he spent his whole life, from 6th grade, he had a vision, this is what he wants to do, really, really hard work. And so he passed away a few years ago, and at his funeral they had to shut down entire streets because you had people from, the sweepers and the cleaners to the heads of state, all come. And they'd all given amazing stories about and how amazing a person he was. And everyone finishes, and then his wife, whom I call Vasudhava, she comes up and she says, well, you've heard all these reasons why my husband was amazing, but let me tell you one more reason. Let me tell you my real reason why I think he was amazing. And the real reason is that we've been married over 50 years, and we've known each other through all kinds of situations, and this was a man who not only did all this, but was walking his talk. This was a man who never once, in our entire time together, got angry with me. It's not just who you are, not just who you are. You're not just what you do. You are who you're becoming through that very process. And all too often, we're so caught up in this mentality of means to an end that I do this to get there. Everything is to get somewhere other than now. And it's like, oh, I don't have time to be nice to you right now. I'll deal with this separately. Or I'm talking to you because you're powerful or rich or famous. And how do you get out of that mentality and you realize that actually my liberation in this moment is tied up with who you are here and now, and I'm present to that fact. And I think when we make ourselves available in that way, you create much more fertile ground for compassion to arise by itself. But I think that's a very different narrative, because if we look at the narrative that we are sort of silent to, sometimes in our schools, because a lot of the parents, and you would have way more experience than I do, I've never run a school, but a lot of the narrative of the students, of the parents, of the funders, of the society at large is, who are you? You are what you have done. You are what you have accomplished. You are how much you accumulate. You are how much power you have. And so how do we turn,
in the presence of all of that narrative, how do we start to turn the tide towards, hey, you are who you're becoming, and I'm here to support that in this very interaction. And that takes a lot of courage to actually rewire all those inner resistances and dismantle the inner structures before we can even get to the outer ones. So I don't know if you have experience in how to support that kind of, dismantling maybe sounds like too violent a word, but how do you stay in integrity because so many times we have two parts of ourselves, right? We have like this one part that is aspiring to something else, and then we have these constraints where we're like, I have 2 kids, and I need to pay these bills, and I need this job at this corporation, and you have to reconcile, and you kind of have to, play with those lemons and create whatever lemonade you can. So I don't know if you would have advice on how you stay in integrity.
I think from my personal experience, what was taking me away from my own integrity was my mind. My mind was constantly wanting something else, craving something else, worrying about something else, anxious about this, thinking about me. And I felt trapped in my way of thinking. And the trap is when we say, well, I will finally be compassionate, or I'll finally find peace when I have the mortgage paid, or when I have the 2.5 kids, or when I find love. But we're chasing it, we never get there.
It's always later.
And the mind is a funny thing. I mean, we have these 60,000 thoughts a day, and a lot of them, because of our biology, it's there to protect us, but it's worrying a lot. The mind's a great thing. I'm not going against the mind. We create the Eiffel Towers, and we send people to the moon. It's this amazing cognitive tool. But society, I think, puts so much emphasis on the cognitive intelligence. And I think that really important in education is to see that the wisdom of the heart, too, and that if we get lost in the mind, then the mind becomes the master, and that's where we get all the anxieties and the fears and the worries. And so, the short answer to that would be, if we can just kind of, in education, I feel, through like social emotional learning programs, is to, my son just bought a little train set, and there's an instruction manual to how to assemble the train set, but we're never given an operating system to how to work with our minds, how to work with regulating our emotions. So we kind of go into life, our parents did the best they could do, the society, offers whatever they offer, but we're never given sort of a roadmap of, hey, this is the cause of suffering, this is what holds us back, this is what limits us, this is what imprisons us, right? And so if you can look a little inside instead of being always constantly out there looking for the next thing, the next thing, the next thing, and realize, well, that's not where I'm going to find it. And if I can just better work with and discover what is it inside of me that's causing this, then I can better understand how my mind works, and then how that's connected with my body and my emotions and my fears and my worries. And then if I can regulate my emotions a little bit better, then I'm not constantly in prison or hijacked by this system, and it offers freedom, it offers a bit of space. The most significant thing I feel is that if our kids and our adults can just go, literally rest our bodies. And instead of being like this, physically, it's just kind of like, open up the heart. And once that comes, the wisdom is there. But we're covering it up with our fears and our worries and our inadequacies. I'm not good enough, I have to prove myself, I have to do this, I have to worry about the next thing. And if I don't worry, something's wrong gonna happen, I gotta keep, it's just this vicious cycle. And so if we can just stop for a second and rest, and just drop all that for a second. It'll be there 10 minutes later if you need it. But for this few moments, I can just rest, come back to myself. Suddenly, you find space, and that space is where you plug into creativity and innovation, and new ideas come, and wisdom comes there. Yeah, so, and in that space, you don't feel so contracted, so then it's just so, there's so much more compassion that comes out of you. It just flows out of you. You're not trying, it's not a strategy, the 5 strategies to be more compassionate. Give me the 5 steps. So I'm not a big fan, even though I do think that some practices can really cultivate compassion. You know, so like one of the practices a very good friend of mine had suggested, and for me it's very important to do it long term. So as a guy, it's kind of strange, but for 3 months, 4 months, every morning I wake up and look in the mirror and say, "Good morning, Richard, I love you." And I would actually pat myself and give myself a hug. I mean, it felt really silly. But my friend, she said, "Just do it, trust me on this." First day it was like embarrassing. I was like, "What am I doing here? This is ridiculous." "Richard, I love you." But something magical happens after the first week, the second week, the third week, the fourth week. Something magically opens up. And it's beautiful. And unless you go through it, you can describe it as much as you want. And I think sometimes that's the other thing, is like, it's like a glass of orange juice. We can write entire essays of what orange juice tastes like. And the pulp and the taste, and it's bitter and sweet and whatever. You have to just pick it up. Drink it, experience it, go for it.
I'd like to add something regarding the orange juice. In order to pass through the ocean, you need to feed the ocean. So,
Has to be ocean.
become the ocean.
Be the ocean.
Well, I think we feel so separate. We feel so separate, and that's pretty scary. Like, I'm here and there's the world, right? And it's a big scary place, or I have to, be compassionate, I have to go out and be kind of the world, but there's a lot of vulnerability. Sometimes kindness is like, or compassion is, I'm gonna be exposed. It's threatening. I can't be compassionate. It's weak. Many cultures, kindness and compassion is weakness. Compassion is not powerful. It's not engaging. It's not courageous enough. Actually, I think compassion can be extremely powerful. Cultivating compassion builds such resilience that you can cross mountains and climb Everest. Far more than fear-based approaches.
I've got stories, like 20 stories in my mind, so I'm not going to go there. It'd be nice to hear a few other questions, but I think the camera person at some point asked a question. There was, he was like, compassion can be taken advantage of. Compassion, people can see it as a sign of weakness. I think that's a legitimate question, but I'll save my story for later. If others have a question, raise your hand.
You also have a question over there.
We do, but it's always nice to get audio input from people too. So if anyone has, yes. I don't know how Leela, jump, come on, Superwoman. and maybe you can also just say your names, just so I have a little bit, so I know how many Andres there are in here. Andreas, sorry.
Hello, my name is Dana, and I just want to say to you, Richard, that you're such a great inspiration for us, for educational system in Romania, and I personally appreciate it very, very, very much, because it seems like it's a new opening that is coming in the education now, and through all these courses that you are inviting us to hear. Personally, I've been to a lot of workshops lately, but to see here this workshop for personal development in education is really very beautiful surprise for us. And I think compassion and other topics related to personal development and personal growing should be first subject to study in our schools. And as I said, it's really very inspiring for other teachers. I own a kindergarten. I'm the founder of a kindergarten and an after school, and it seems like there's hope for us here in Romania to change a little bit our system, which we all know has its difficulties and problems. And if all of us, not all of us, one by one could have such an approach as you have at Verita Foundation and in school, this would be step by step. The new world, the new changes that we all want, we all expect, but everybody is complaining that our educational system is not working so well, and now I see there is hope for us here in Romania, and I appreciate a lot what you are doing here, and as I said, you are a great inspiration for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have a question there. See, Richard, I gave a whole hour-long talk, and it was like, you're like 5 minutes. And Richard, you're so inspiring, man. This is amazing.
Well, you inspired me, so you're directly getting a compliment too.
So thank you again for being here, both of you. I am fascinated about how human brain works, and the fact that we are positioning ourselves, humans, to be the smartest species on Earth. Also has, this arrogance has, I think, a downside, because we might not see what we are missing, being so much more on our heads, like you said, on what can we build, how can you make money, how can you be better and good, and, I don't know, build some dreams. But these simple things of communities, like bonobo monkeys who care for themselves to lower stress and actually, I don't know, clean their fur, connection, I think, is the one missing piece. And when connecting, I'm starting to develop a bit on how can we give. My basic idea is that you cannot give unless you have. So first, it starts with gratitude on what you have first, to be sane and to stay straight. And I think my question would go around, how can you be compassionate not out of a need that you have, not from being passively drawn into a trauma or drama that's happening where you are compelled to go and help, but rather to make it as a good habit, to embody it in your structure, to know how much can you give to still be yourself and to be safe, not to be running around like I need to help everybody, but to be there like something that still continues after you give, and you can come back to and still leave the place clean and standing straight. I don't know if you get what I mean. Like, you need to still be you to be able to be compassionate. Something, maybe you have an advice on how to keep yourself.
Go for it. It's like, you know, inspire us.
I like the analogy that the heart has to pump blood first to itself before it can pump blood to the rest of the body. So I like that analogy because sometimes, even as a parent or as a teacher, you feel compelled that I have to help here, I have to help there, but it's really important to have that self-nourishment and to listen to your heart, and you know that even our own heart pumps blood to itself before to the heart before it pumps to the blood to the rest of the body. Or on an airplane, they always say, put your mask on first and then put it on the child. So I think that's really important. That metaphor helps me a lot. I think also when you're coming from it as I have to fix the world is something that you alluded to, that it's broken and I have to fix it, and it has this sort of missionary zeal that there's something incomplete and we have to fix it, creates an angst there that brings a lot of burnout. And I've seen many people who are very strong in their opinions, even if they're people for global warming, but it's, you're the battle, and that's where you need a lot of compassion, because actually, how will that gap be bridged between those people who are over there and you're over there? And I know you feel that there's a fire and it's anxious and something's going to go wrong, but by saying that they're the devil, you're not saying it, but that's how it feels, the energy. Well, they're not going to be receptive in any way. I think compassion is a great, if you're going to be manipulative about it, compassion is a great negotiating process, because I understand where you're coming from, and the greatest opportunity for change is if I can listen deeply to your position, and it's not this existential thing that you blame or I have to fix it in some way. That there is this deep-rooted okayness that I'm okay right here, right now. There's no fire to put out. There's nothing right here. There has to be something. Everything is already and always complete here. And then from that space, you can create such dynamic help. I think in many ways I have to be the good person, I have to be the compassionate person, and it becomes an identity, and I have to fix something, and I go out here, and I go there, and I go there, and I go there, and I go there. And I think actually great resolution comes when you're speaking to somebody and you just feel this sort of completeness, and the other person relaxes. And I think there's much less burnout in that sense. I love the analogy I just saw. I think Leela sent it to me recently. It's like if there was to be a crisis, a bomb exploded, or there was a huge typhoon that came in and there was just carnage everywhere. I mean, if people would be just going, just imagine if it's just like these calm angels that came down, and they were not like, oh my God, it's terrible, it's horrible, this drama, oh my God, the world's ending, we have to fix it. They just go with such presence and such compassion, with such open-heartedness, and they're helping, and they're supporting, and they're taking care of whoever needs to be taken care of, and there's such lightness to that. It's a beautiful thing when there's no agenda that I have to fix you and I have to make it. It's just simple compassion, and then you move on, or you fix. It's kind of like a flow rather than oh my God. It's like almost in your body. It's a tightening. Even though you're doing it, it's for a good cause, but you're still having this.
I would add to that. Can you hear me? Should I just use that? Is this fine? Okay, great. I'll say something provocative, maybe. This is going to wake us up. Maybe it's provocative, but I actually don't like the term self-compassion. And most neuroscientists also don't like the term self-compassion, because neuroscience tells us that there's no static self. That it's actually more inner compassion. And what inner compassion leads to is a consequence of that inner compassion is to be gentle. And if you look at the world, Gabriella and I were talking about this earlier, she says when you are not connected to actually get stuff done, you need a lot more power. So connection is inversely proportional to power and coercion. So all too often, when we don't have that gentleness and we're not predisposed to, and we're not familiar with what it means to lead in a gentle way, we tend to go towards coercion, and its cousin, its sibling, is transaction. So we turn everything into a transaction. And so what does it mean to hold yourself in a gentle way through all your ups and downs, so that you can hold the whole world in a gentle way, so that you are not transacting, you're not using people as a means to an end, but as an end in itself. Like, there is no agenda for love. I'm not loving you so that we can be better friends tomorrow. I'm not loving you so I don't burn out. I'm not loving you so I can get ahead. I'm loving you just for love. And that's where we really want to get to. And if you look, if I consider my social change heroes, for example, Gandhi, as we spoke about him earlier, Gandhi used to have 1-minute meetings. Can you imagine, like, the state of stress a person would be? You are responsible for the whole, whole country. All these people are looking up to you. And you get 1-minute meetings with people. When he would go from a train station, when he would take a train ride from here to here, in between there's train stops. At every train stop, he comes outside and there's throngs of people. Now, such a person doing so much, with so much responsibility, you would think would be exhausted and burnt out and stressed out. But he was not. He never needed any vacation. So you look at that and you say, what is the regeneration that is happening inside this person? And it's not like he was an exception. There are so many people, like Mother Teresa, like Martin Luther King. They were fueled by a very different inner fuel. I guess they were fueled by an inner fuel. That doesn't sound right, but with all your teachers here, I'm sure but what is that? And what is, and who do you have to be? And I think this is where it really comes down to being gentle. Gandhi actually said this: in a gentle way, you can shake the world. He never actually wanted coercion. He never othered. He never said, oh, the British are the other, they're the enemy. In fact, the guy who put him in jail in South Africa, he actually made shoes for him. And, and generally, Jan Smuts, whom he made shoes for, there's this famous quote by him. He gives this speech and he says, it was my honor to lose to a man like Gandhi. And while I put him in jail, he made me shoes by hand, not shoes, but these slippers, whatever you call them. And he says, he made me these shoes, and I am not man enough to be in those shoes, though that needs to be in the museum, and it is in the museum today. So who was this guy that was able to topple, that was able to handle all these intense challenges, have 1-minute meetings, get down at every train station, do this without a vacation for 60, 70 years? Was he superhuman and extra, or was it actually his organizing principles? Why did he say, he didn't say go out and create the change you wish to see in the world. He didn't say go out and talk about the change you wish to see in the world. He said that the greatest point of leverage, as important as those other things are, the greatest point of leverage is actually you being the change you wish to see in the world, because that will create this inner gentleness, this inner compassion, which will then allow you to engage with people in a non-transactional way with much more connection, and that will regenerate, and that will continue your journey without burning out. So I think there's a lot to unpack in this whole trajectory from burnout to, why are we so tough on ourselves, to go from that to gentleness, to transaction, to regeneration. So that's a mouthful, but
Can I have one more? Sorry.
Well, let's see if we. Okay.
Sorry, this is just for you because it's a nice trend that you're setting. You have a school, right, with parents and teachers. But what you do today is not just for them. And I'm not a parent of a child who's here, but I am here as a parent and as a person. And my question to you is, do you envision to have inspirational meetings like this who can be opened to parents, whoever they might be in Bucharest, Romania, or whatever? Do you want to make it as a powerful social impact, or is it just something that you built here and you just let it be and see what's happening from there, because you already know what part of the equation you are building upon that?
And this is being recorded, so yeah, this is going to become a meme real soon, yes.
I wish I could say I had some long-term strategic plan in all this, but really it's all just spontaneously happened without my doing, so I can't take credit for it. I mean, Leela and so many other people have so much to do with it. I think it was more like creating a canvas that just started to spontaneously grow organically in ways I never expected. And it's not my painting, it's our painting, 80 teachers worth of paintings. And my goal would probably be to create a canvas that will allow everyone to express something of what they find is important and make it materialize. For now, the direction it's going in is primarily teachers in the state school systems around Romania. So, you know, I was talking to somebody in the coffee break and they were saying, you know, teaching is such a hard job and they have to teach 30 children and they don't have support from the management and the system is so, you know, archaic and they get no support and they feel so overwhelmed. I mean, this is all great, Richard, but, you know, reality hits to these poor teachers. And how do we teach compassion to these kids that are coming from such difficult backgrounds? And I would just have a very simple intention, and that would be, these teachers are facing so much. I wouldn't even go as far as saying I want to teach compassion to the students in terms through the teachers giving them lessons. It's more like, if they can learn to take care of themselves through all, they need it more than anyone else, the overwhelm that they must feel having 3 different age groups. I've been to schools around, and it's just unbelievable. They have 40 kids in a class, and they have a year 7, 8, and 9 in the classes. I mean, you have a kid who's this tall, then you have a kid this tall, and they have to teach math at the same time with no resources. I mean, it's impossible. And there's a lot of self-judgment on that, and there's a lot of self-criticism, and there's a lot of burnout. So if we could just offer some kind of relief in competencies and skills and give them something in order for them to know how to even regulate for themselves, bring self-compassion to themselves, that will change the dynamic. Even if they don't say anything to the children, when the children walk into that classroom, it has a different fragrance. Because they're not trying to just survive anymore. So if we can just give those teachers, and our teachers, because our teachers have a hard time too, it's not just the state school systems. If our teachers have more joy, if our teachers can reconnect with their heart, if they can just let go a little bit and enjoy the process, and even through all the challenges that come in, because being compassionate doesn't mean that we whitewash the difficulties, you know? And just offer some strategies, some support, a support system, maybe online or with an 8-week program. Then we can slowly create more and more teachers in many different rural areas that they can open their hearts more, because I think connection with children is the most important thing. It's the plate. You know, you add onto the plate math and science and English, but the actual foundation is connection with children. And that bond is the most important. Going to your question about parents, I don't know if that might be something to look at, because obviously in our school we realize that no matter what we do with the students, it's not a complete picture unless you work with parents. So that's something we're doing within our school, and we're trying to invite parents to be part of it, to build their own social emotional learning, you know, because I think none of us really remember what our parents preached. You know, I think what we leave as a legacy is we remember how they made us feel. Our nervous system is an imprint of their nervous system, of their restlessness or calmness. You know, many parents come to me and say, Richard, you know, tell me how to help me be a better parent. Give me what parenting strategies. And I say, there are great strategies, and there are a lot of parenting strategies out there that are great, but the most important is work on yourself. Be good in yourself, in your shoes, find your happiness, find your joy, and the rest will happen by itself. You know, we have this thing called the green zone and the red zone. Red zone's where you're angry, green zone's where you're confident and you're happy. Find a way to get into your green zone, and guess what? The kids will model your green zone too. You know, so I don't know where this will go. I have no idea. But I just trusting the process of it for sure. And that might be one of the routes we'll go. I mean, I don't know.
if I can respond on behalf of Richard and Leela, knowing them, I just met them, you know, on this trip in person, but they're so aligned with these values, even outside of their formal roles. I don't even know what those are, but just knowing them as human beings, I think they really care for these values. And if your question is this about Verita, or is this about just education, or is this about society at large, or is this just about Romania, or is this just about the world at large? I don't think they're opposed to the world at large. You know, I think it depends on you and I. If you come up, and certainly if you come up to me, and I think I can speak on behalf of them, and if you say, we should do a thing with parents, or somebody came up and said, we need to bring this to the business world. You're doing stuff in technology, you know, we were talking about technology, and what does intertransformation to information technology bridge look like? I mean, it's up to us, right? And if you come up, I can't imagine any of the three of us or the people behind us saying no. I mean, this is not like a neat little box and this is where we want it to go. This is more like we're in service to these values. And these values are in so much need and demand in so many contexts. And so if you're moved to it, you want to, you know, we're bogies behind your engine. And tell us how, I mean, you know, these guys, Leela's like, oh my God, very tough foundation, no.
No, actually, I had opened my mic and I was going to tell her that, talk to me later.
Yeah, exactly. We had a hand up here and a hand back there. Ed, we'll go here first.
Thank you. I have two questions, I'm sorry. One is related to what you said last, please. I wrote it down. How do you empower teachers or people in general that you work with, but mostly teachers, in order to take care of themselves and understand how important it is in this process of being role models or guides for the children that they are working with, besides telling them that it's important, or maybe some other, what methods do you use in order to tackle this reactions that sometimes they have? Yeah, but we don't know the reality in my classroom. Yeah, but I cannot. There's so much going on. I cannot stop and take care of myself. How do you intend, or how do you do it? How do you empower them to take care of themselves?
You want to throw in your second question also?
If it's okay, I would like to...
Just one at a time? All right.
Yeah.
If it's okay with them, it's okay. Go ahead.
So that it's not chaos.
Well, I'm relatively new in the education, so it's only been a few years. I can tell you that Verita actually started with our companies first. So I'm an entrepreneur. That was my formal background. And some of you are in the room that were part of this. And we used to do a lot of team buildings every year in our companies, not in our school. And we would take our people, we'd go up to the mountains for 3-4 days and have fun, party, do a few trainings, a few coachings, and we'd come home and say what a great time we had. And we'd spend a lot of money on those things. And I just felt that it was a bit superficial. And I wanted to tackle the fact that a lot of people in work feel indifferent about their work. They don't feel engaged, they don't feel passionate about it, they don't feel joy in it. And I was like, why? Many times people hear me say in places I've worked is, if you're not happy, find another job. I'm not saying that like in a negative, I'm saying find what you love. It's crazy to stay here. I'll help you find what you love. You know, because it's silly to be in a place where you just feel miserable, right? So I always feel that if they can get in contact with that joy, with that passion, then they will just fly. So how we started is we just completely trashed the team buildings and said, that's not happening again. And we did a 6 months, 3 months, Leela, how 3 months was it?
No, the program was 8 weeks.
8 weeks, so 8 weeks. And we had 3 different groups that we rotated. And basically, we did workshops during the office hours, so they didn't have to feel like they're doing something extra. And we had different experts come in on self-regulation. There were yoga teachers, there was mindfulness teachers, there was meditation, there was massages, there was Pilates, there was, how to connect with yourself, there was, all the types of skills and competencies that we felt is like, find yourself, connect with yourself, find what you're passionate about, you know, we care about you, and there's no agenda here. Many times people say, well, what's the catch? It's like at the end of this, each workshop, you're gonna say, and then go sell, you know, and they were really surprised that there was no agenda to it. And so that's a great impact that I think is a great way of doing it. We started to do the same thing in the school, so I think that we started first with what's the most important thing for the kids? Let's focus on the kids, the kids, the kids, the kids. And then we said, okay, we got to find the curriculums. Let's go look at the curriculum. So we got to search. We searched the whole world for all the different kind of curriculums. What's out there? Second step, SEE, da da da. And they were like, no, we have to focus on the parents. So we, you know, let's talk to the parents. The last chapter of this now, which is what we're doing now more recently, is no, everything's about the teachers. If teachers are happy, teachers have joy, it will trickle down to in the classroom to the children. If you get that right, you get the rest of it right. So, yeah, whether it's mindfulness sessions for teachers in school, if it's, you know, we do massages in the school, and over time, this is still in the process, is to bring in, you know, leaders and trainers from outside or within our organization to offer these skills and competencies, because I think it's an actual roadmap you can provide teachers. Give them that know-how of how to sustain themselves, how to work with these overwhelming emotions. A lot of people, it's like this, it's in their darkest secret place down there. They don't, it's really deep stuff. It takes 2-3 years to work this through, and people are not feeling comfortable about it, and it's something very vulnerable, and, you know, and so it's a process. So you can't force them. You can't like tell them this is mandatory. It's whoever's willing to be part of it, whoever's not. I do feel that over time, people hear it and then just like it goes over their head, and then over, you know, after 2-3 years, they say, "I got it. Now I got it." After, you know, 3 years of telling me, now I'm open enough to take it in. But I think a lot of it is about the well-being of the teachers, and if you focus on that and you connect with that, and so I think the next few years will be a lot more about that, and keep using that also in our 8-week program we're doing for teachers in the state school systems. And that's a big push, I think. So if you're asking me, the next few years will be mainly about that. Those are the big areas of transformation we want to make. Because at the end of the day, if you want to teach compassion to students, and you want to teach self-regulation tools and social emotional learning strategies to children, you have to actually live them and breathe them, and actually it has to be alive. You can't just say, today we're going to learn about this, 1, 2, 3, and the kids feel it if it's not who you are. Let alone that I think it's the most important thing for teachers to learn how to connect with kids and how to connect with everyone around them. I mean, when we talk about compassion, for me, compassion is for me a deep connection. And if you look at the metaphor I like to use with the kids, it's like there's an invisible plug. So I'm having a conversation with you, right? But 95% of communication is nonverbal. And there's just this invisible plug, right? So as I'm talking to you, my heart is saying, you know, you're beautiful. You're amazing. And it's kind of like, everything's okay. How can I soothe you? That's the bodily message I'm sending, the vibrations I'm sending, the energy I'm sending. And you will know really quickly with a child, or with my sons, or with your wife or husband or whatever, the moment that plug is pulled out. An untruth, something you don't say that's true, a judgment. If you're really subtle to this vibrations energy, you'll quickly know how it's pulled out. And most of us are so cognitive, we're not yet in tune with the subtleties, the more subtle vibrations of communication. With children, I think 95% of it is that. And so many times teachers are so cognitive and saying, give me the 5 steps how to have behavioral management in the classroom. And not that that's not important, but they're missing the elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room is, how do I connect deeply in this way? Because that's what the kids are screaming for. Their misbehavior is, I want that connection. Maybe I don't get it at home. Maybe I feel restless in other ways. I don't have it to model. And maybe I need it more so from you as the teacher. And most of the time we're blaming the kids, we're angry with the kids, rather than just subtly saying, that's what he really wants. He wants that connection. Which is, at the end of the day, is just this beautiful love and acceptance. And just like they're just kind of subtly telling me everything's okay, everything's beautiful. And then just something magic happens and, they start to behave, and even in that anger, I mean, I have 3 sons, I have a teenager, and sometimes you just want to take them and throw them out the window, right? But right there, you're having faith, you're making a leap of trust that, okay, I'm going to have my heart open and I'm just going to connect there with him. He might not hear it right now. He might be just so angry with me because I don't get it, and I'm not going to go there and play the lawyer with him and back and forth debate. I'm going to just consistently stay with him there. And he's maybe won't figure it out now. Maybe when he's 25, he'll say, that's what my dad was doing. He didn't always agree with me. Open-hearted compassion doesn't mean you can run all over me. Like, compassion doesn't mean, you can go in the supermarket and take any cereal you want. Take it all. Eat it all. Yes, honey, I'm compassionate. No, there are limits. No. Actually, being compassionate is more important when the no comes. Like, man, that's really a bummer. I know, I didn't sleep last night either, and we gotta leave in 10 minutes. So you gotta get out of bed this morning. Both my sons came and they hated me for it. This is so unfair! Why are you taking me to these conferences? And I said, I know, it's a bummer. I didn't sleep last night. I had a bit of a sore throat, and I didn't sleep really well, but we're going in 10 minutes. But what I'm showing with my body and my heart is, I just love you, and I know, and I'm here. And it's just consistent, and it's there, and it's hard. It's hard, but that's what, at the end of the day, is the only thing I can give them is that stability, that balance, and it's nonverbal, 95% of it. And you just stand there, and then they want to push on it, they want to push it, they want to push the limits, and you're just there, consistent there, and it's just very clear energy. It's a very clear energy. And then 5 minutes later, 10 minutes later, 15 minutes, it's gone. But many times we feel threatened by it, we feel that it's disrespectful, and then there's just this struggle, power struggle that goes on. And we need to model that, I think, as teachers, too. And it's a hell of a lot easier, because it's really stressful to get in that lawyer mode with our children and with our students and power struggle. It's exhausting. You can be in a constant mode of control with the kids in the class. It'll be never end. You will never end that process if you go there. So.
Thank you very much. And then the second one, because you made me promise I will ask it out loud. I was wondering, how do we bring men into this type of conversation? Really, in the sense that,
But we have
not by force, but how do we communicate with them so that we also reach them into the conversation with compassion, not saying you have to, you're not able to express your emotions, our men don't know how to do that. No, with compassion, because, and that was not there. How do we bring them into this?
I think that's an important question, because we both had the same realization in our workshop that it was, 2 men, and there were 2 of us on the outside too, but the rest were women. At one level, I think the divine feminine is what the world needs, and so we actually need to amplify that, and we need to have more women in leadership to, I think, balance the yin and the yang, so to speak. So at some level, I think it's great and wonderful that we're all innovating with the leadership of women in education. But I think to your larger question, which is that, let's say an audience doesn't hear us, how do you reach out to that audience? How do you reach out to that person or that community or that demographic or across barriers? And I think that's a big question of how do we make this. And for me, the response is that we have to make compassion relevant. And relevant looks different for different people. Somebody asked me, how do you get kids to be compassionate when they see it as a sign of weakness? Or, how do we... And I think to make it relevant to young people, you have to make it cool to be kind. You have to make it cool to be, to be compassionate. For example, the smile cards that I mentioned. It actually started in a conversation in a basement with all these young people, and they were talking about pranks. And they had these elaborate pranks that they would do. They would scheme, they come together, and they plan all this stuff, and then they basically make your life miserable. And so I said, oh, why do you... So just a genuine inquiry, why were you doing this when it was so destructive, right? Like your whole group as a college went and burned down all this stuff on the field. Okay, that was very challenging, that was very creative, that was very, it had its own kind of fulfillment, but I said, can we turn it from a negative prank to a positive prank? Can you do something constructive that is incredibly difficult, that requires the same creativity, requires the same enthusiasm, requires you to be collaborative with other people, and can you then go even one step further and not get credit for it? That to be selfless requires so much courage. That to get credit, say, hey, you did this, you're amazing, that's one thing. But to actually do it, put the brakes on the ego, and to say, hey, I'm not even going to get credit for it. Here's a smile card. Somebody did it for you, you pay it forward. I'm not even there to get the feedback loop of the smile. Now that to me is amazing. Are you up for that? And when you frame it in that way, kids are totally on it. So I think a question is, like same with the business world, you would frame it in a different way. So the question is, how do you translate? And translation isn't English to Romanian. Translation is, to translate into, how do you get an engineer to think about this? Is a very different language than how do you get an artist? We have a flute player amongst us. Maybe we'll put him on the spot tomorrow. Bring your flute tomorrow. How do you get an artist to reflect on compassion? How do you get a parent to reflect on compassion? How do you get a teacher to reflect? And these are all different translations that we need to do. And I think it's a call to our creativity. Compassion is fundamentally relevant to everything. That is my belief. That is a ton of neuroscience behind it. But do we have the bridges? Do we have the translations? Absolutely not. And why do we not have the translations? Because maybe there isn't a business case to be made for it. Okay, well, then maybe some people are inspired and say, how can we make a business case? Great. My approach is forget the business case. I'm going to appeal to your humanity. I want to translate it into, I'm an engineer, for example, I want to translate it into engineering. I'm willing to do it just for the love of it. Are you willing to do it for the love of it? And if you are, let's start. 2 people, you start doing it, and I know that compassion is contagious, and it spreads. That's the service-based story, right? The organization that we started, 4 of us started it, and now it's like touching millions of people every month. And really, it's this. It's the power of raw love. And so I have this faith, but I think it requires homework. And again, it requires you and I to kind of say, I'm in this context, there is no translation of compassion, how do I make compassion relevant? And to not just appease to the cognitive part of it, and to say, let me tell you 10 sources of why, the neuroscience of what's happening. You're going to lose people. That may work in a certain demographic, and that's a great translation mechanism. But you go to kids, and we were talking about this earlier with Gabriella, right? Like the adults, the most common question that adults would ask me is, all of a sudden my mic got louder. All of a sudden, you ask adults or you talk about this to adults, they will say, well, how do you sustain yourself if you're all about kindness and compassion? You talk to kids, and the kids are saying, what's the coolest act of kindness you've done? Because I want to go out and do that, and maybe one more on top of that. So I think the challenge is in creating the translations to different contexts, and I think we have to think outside the box, and we have to bring people together that care, all of us here, and say, let's step it up. Like, let's step up our game. I'm not waiting for somebody else. I'm willing to roll up my sleeves and do it myself. If you want to translate the kindness diaries in Romania, you're not going to wait for some staff person to do it somewhere. Do it yourself. Okay, you only have time for a day, you have time for another day, I have time for another day, and then we bring it together. Right? So how do we start to have that mentality and just make compassion relevant is a question that, that I hold and I think is a great opportunity. You may have more contextual to education. Like how do you make more?
Well, I think she was alluding to the male side of it. I think many men feel the dryness of it. I mean, they want to open their hearts too. And there is this stereotype of the male strong. Again, that false perception that being vulnerable is weak, and that the only way to go through this is with my mind, and I have to, But what life will finally, life is a great lesson for you. It's a great teacher. You'll bang your head until you get exhausted, and there's a dryness there if you just go cognitive. Even from a performance perspective, the great creativity, the great passion, the great spontaneity comes with connecting great arts work, great music, come from here. And so I think so many times for men also, it's hard for them because they're even more here than here. And a lot of it is, obviously, I'm not an expert, obviously there's a lot of it is biology, but I think most of it is the society we grow up in. The nurture part. And again, half of every man is made from a woman. I think we also have the female energy in us too. It's just culturally, we have to be the strong ones, we have to go out and do the whatever, and you see on the sports, and you see it on the advertisement, the man has to be that. So I think as the stereotypes start to change, and I think all these changes in, what is gender, I think things are starting to be grayer in other countries. I think that will open up a lot of things also, and it's uncomfortable, it's strange, but I think men definitely have to be more in contact with the feminine side of them. And it comes to more passion, more open-heartedness, more connection to life, because it's a dry area to be only cognitive. And you burn out easily. Men, because I work with a lot of corporate men in the years to go, managers, whatever, they get burned out really hard because they're just up here. And they lose it here, and they lose it with their families, they lose it with, they need to connect with that, and they want to. It's not that they don't want to. They just don't know how to, and it's practicing the muscle. It's a skill you can develop over time. There was another question somewhere, I don't know.
Hi, my name is Fundatia. Part of my question was answered because we struggle with the situation in our neighborhood. We teach our daughters to be kind and respect kids and neighbors, but we are facing a group that is mostly, the kids are governed by two bullies, and basically that's what happens when kids go outside. The bully side and the bullied one. I tried an approach with them, but I faced resistance, mostly from the parents. And the question was, how do you approach with compassion a group like that? Parents mostly focus on enjoying their time without the kids, let the kids on the street, and us parents let's gather in a backyard and have a barbecue and talk about our things and just whatever. And the kids let on the streets do whatever. Don't complain, don't come to me with your problem. So basically, I was the only parent in the group with the kid. I have a small girl, she's 2, and I couldn't leave her alone with them, so I had to be there, and I saw the problems between the kids. I tried to act there, but then I saw some resistance from the parents, and their tendency to isolate whoever thought differently. I mean, we are trying to get rid of the kids. We want to spend our time here enjoying the backyard and the barbecue. We don't want to deal with kids from. So part of the question was answered with this creativity. Maybe I didn't use my creativity enough. And maybe I can find another way to address this situation. Or if you have any other ideas, what we could do in order to keep playing outside without facing this resistance. And for us, that was to keep creating connections with our neighbors without giving up our values. Because we would like to spend time with our kids. We don't isolate them on the street. We like to play with them and still talk to the other parents or still have a barbecue together with our kids. We in the backyard with the kids on the
Should we take one more comment if we have a hand, and then, or what's our time like?
We have around 10-15 more minutes.
10-15 minutes? Okay. Do you want to respond, or do you want to take another comment, or how do you want to do that? I mean, of course, that's a very bullying, and I'm sure you thought deeply about it.
It's something that concerns me a lot. I think that that's why focusing on parents and teachers to connect with this knowledge and competencies of connecting with our hearts, understanding what compassion is, opening our hearts is so important work, because society is changing and it's being polarized in so many ways. And so it is a concern of mine that, for example, with technology, kids are just seeing on YouTube how cool it is to bully, or these memes that go out and this negativity, and they're being exposed to such a young age at such negativity and whatever it is on YouTube and TV, and they're exposed to so much more than we ever were in our generation. Then you have parents who are so busy and they want the barbecue because they're so exhausted inside, right? Because they're working all day long, and then they go home and it's really overwhelming for them to be with the kids. And so I find that a lot of kids are neglected because of that. And I'm not talking only poor kids, or even in the well-affluent families, it stays with the nannies or so forth, because the parents are trying to cope. And I'm not saying this in a judgmental way. Parenting is really hard, and they're trying. A lot of them I've met, they're trying to just get by, and it's really hard for them. And so many parents are getting divorced, and so many, there's all this, it's almost look good, I'm not saying, but there's sort of this shift happening in society. And if you turn on the TV or you look on the internet, I think that's why this is so important, because look at the world where we are today because of it. It's not working. And the pressure is getting stronger and stronger because you see what's happening in our politics and the nationalism and global warming. I mean, the world, the earth is getting to a point where either we get this or we won't survive. It's like we have a 50-50 chance. If we continue in this way, it's just, we're reached a point now where it's time. We have to man up and make it happen. And so either we're going deeper into sort of sleeping and just trying to avoid it and just mass distraction in our computers and our iPads and Facebook and the malls and 10 more series of Netflix and so forth, just to avoid this discomfort and what we're feeling and avoid and our kids are copying the same thing. So it's a big issue, and there's no real, I don't have a solution for you. I just know that that's the driving force for what we're doing, not just for the small little community we're building, but trying to spread it out as much as possible in every way we can, because I think we all need it. We all need that more and more and more. So I can't address that specific thing, but it's definitely a big concern of mine, and I feel it and see it, and you know, the good news is that there's a way out. I see it, I feel it, and there's so many wonderful stories I hear of people really wanting something and making such brave steps to make that change. Whether it's a career change, whether it's a relationship change, whether it's I want to make a new life, and whatever it is, there is a hunger for it. The parents a lot of parents that come to our school say, we want something different, I feel it, and they're hungry for the information, they really want that, and they feel it, and a lot of them are going through their own transformations, and it's wonderful to see that. I didn't see that 10, 15 years ago, so there's a lot of good signs too. But of course, it's messy, and it's encouraging and yet scary, and I don't know what the result will be, and it will be very interesting to see. And I think the more conscious we can be and the more wise we can be, that's the only thing we can do, walk our talk and keep doing that despite all the differences out there. And it might be a very lonely journey sometimes, you know, but you just, you walk the path and stay grounded with you and your daughter. Is it daughter? Son. And all will be well from your perspective, and that's all you can control because you can't control the rest anyway, so do the best you can.
Thank you.
You want to go to closing remarks? Ish?
Do you have any closing remarks? I can come up with something.
I'll give you time. Let me close first.
Okay, good. Go ahead.
I just want to check because I think there was there another question?
There's a question here and there.
Tomorrow is okay, tomorrow.
Oh, tomorrow?
She said it's okay tomorrow if you want to address it now. It's okay tomorrow.
Yeah.
How much time do we have left?
7 minutes.
Minus
Minus 7. No, Gabriella, go for it. You just break the rules and grab a mic.
I don't think the closing statements will be 7 minutes long.
My name is Gabriella, and I want to use this opportunity make a deep bow to the two of you and to all the people present here for their interest into the topic. I want to tell you that for I don't know how many years we know each other, I've learned lots of things from Richard. The greatest of all is this kindness thing, compassion, everything, you name it. And I'm really grateful I've met Mr. Mehta because I feel we speak the same language, and I'm so happy to discover other people talking the same language as us. I was impressed by the interest of you in the workshop. I hope this is a beginning of something we can continue. And I just wanted to express my gratitude. Thank you very much.
I want to add a comment to this theme. I can say that there's been many creative responses to bullying, and we can talk about that afterwards. Like for instance, just in brief, this one woman, she was a teacher, and in her classroom, there was a Columbine sort of massacre in America, and she says, what should I do? She did something very simple in her classroom. She asked everybody, who do you want to sit next to for the coming week? She changed seating charts every week. And everyone had like list 4 people that you want to sit next to. Every Friday, she would sit with those sheets of paper, and she's looking for the loneliest child. She's looking for how someone was popular last week and this week they weren't popular. And if you can catch that in the seed, they start to. And I want to tell you the story of one of my friends, Pancho. I wish I had, maybe I'll bring a visual of it tomorrow. This guy, in the US, you had this whole thing between Occupy movement. I don't know if you're familiar with it here, but there was this huge movement. And it was 99% versus the 1%, all this stuff. And the first place that the police showdown happened with the Occupy movement was in a city called Oakland, which is near where I live. And so everyone is raising up their narrative of like violence because, oh, you know, people are going to get violent and the police are bringing in more and more troops and they've got choppers and and they've given this deadline, 6 a.m. in the morning. And after this, we're going to use force. So you have till 6 a.m., you can get out. Pancho, one of our volunteers, one of my very close friends, hears this at midnight. And he says, if people are going to step up their violence, I'm going to step up my compassion. And so he says, what am I going to do? He decides to go there and meditate in silence. A bunch of people saw him and joined him. His roommate also came. And here they are, and this was a photo that went completely viral all over the world the very next day, because you saw police in this riot gear trying to tame people who were meditating. And when Pancho went to jail, because they booked him, right? And his offense, we have to write down why you're booking somebody, taking them to jail. His offense, right? Disturbing peace. And so he goes in, and he is locked up because they're so afraid. He's like this lovable, skinny Mexican guy. He's like, you can't, no fly would be afraid of him. But he goes into jail, and you have different categories. Right? And he was assigned in the ultra-red category, which means motion restricted. Like everything handcuffed and motion restricted. And he's like sitting there in his, as he's getting locked up. But he's looking at this and he's saying, every moment I can be creative with my compassion and kindness. So he looks at the woman that's shackling him up. And he says, sister, you're too beautiful to be doing this work. And no one in that setting, in the ultra-red context, ever had said that. This woman starts weeping inside the jail cell. He puts him in, and he's in this context where it's like lights are on 24 hours. It's completely dehumanizing. Every hour, the door opens, right? If you're in that setting, you're going to be irritable, you're going to be, and Pancho is even vegan, and there's no vegan food. There's an orange you get one day, and then all the other prisoners heard about what he's doing. They're sending him oranges, and oranges is how he's surviving this whole time, and he's in there. And his motion is restricted. And this filthy place, and they have, the toilets are right over there, no doors, and you're just stuck in this place. He was there, in his case, in this particular instance, for 4 days. He's inside there, and he puts his 2 shoes, and he sits down on the ground, like on a meditation. And the guards come and they're like, what is this guy doing? Because they have no idea. Like, what are you doing? And he says, hey, this is self-care. You take a shower every day, take care of your body. This is how I take care of my mind. And so they're like, interesting. They don't know what they're doing. So the second day they come, and they're like, hey man, do you mind if we take a selfie? They've never seen anybody in this kind of a context. He's like super, he has zero, he's like not feeling threatened by anybody, and he's spreading his love, and he has built his compassion muscle to such a degree that even in this intense setting, you're not able to sway him, you're not able to get anger out of him. And so he's right there, and these guys are like, man, what is this guy smoking? So they take a selfie. And the third day, so in this prison, they give you this small thing with this is the only thing you get. You get a little packet with like a piece of paper and a pencil, toothbrush, and all like basic things, right? And so the third day he goes to them and he says, hey brother, and he calls everybody brother and sister, so this is actually Pancho. So he says, hey brother, can I ask you for a favor? And now they had asked him for a selfie the day before. He had said yes. And so now they're listening to him. And he says, can I get another one of those packets? And he's like, and their first thought is, what are you going to do with like an extra toothbrush? And like, they were thinking, can it be abused in some way? No, and this guy's just sitting there, he's living on oranges, okay, fine. They give it to him. What Pancho does is he cleans that entire cell. And he goes and he writes on that piece of paper, dear brother, you don't know me, but I was in the jail cell before you. And I have cleaned this place up so you have a nice place here to land. May you pay it forward. He made his own smile card with his motion restricted in ultra red, just eating oranges, and in this dehumanizing context. Now you tell me, is anger weak or is that kind of compassion weak? There is just no chance that any sane person would say, oh, that's so weak, man. Oh, that's so wimpy. Yeah, you kind, lovey-dovey people. And if that was just one story, that would be one thing. But I can tell you so many such stories. But you will not hear them on CNN. You will not hear them on any main news because they're looking to monetize with a cheap, quick story. And people like Pancho, they're not even interested. When the New York Times got him, he does this all over the place. I can tell you more stories. If I could do a whole session on Pancho stories. When New York Times, he's being interviewed, right? Because he's done lots of courageous things like that. And at some point, they're like, okay, can you say it in this way? And he's like, no, I'm saying it the way I'm saying it. And they didn't want to print it. And so Pancho said, I'm no longer doing mass media. He wants it to be heard from me to you to somebody else because that's deep. And that's a totally new narrative, right? Even of distribution, not just the content of the stories, but how they're distributed. So it takes all of us, right? In this many-to-many network, compassion is certainly not for the weak. It's certainly not wimpy, right? It is very courageous. We all are recipients of it. Even our mothers giving us 9 months of unconditional love is an absolute act of remarkable courage and remarkable love that we can never pay back. So we are all indebted. We have to pay forward, but we need that new story to wrap ourselves around and create new systems that honor these kinds of capital. And I think that's why this is so significant here, that we're having this conversation and we're saying, like you said, you know, like how do we turn the tide from a certain kind of narrative which is extractive to a narrative which is much more collaborative, much more compassionate, much more connected. And I think it takes all of us. I'm in it with all of you. You guys are in it with each other as well. So together we can create some kind of movement. And it starts here and now. And it starts with each one of us realizing the potential of compassion. So thank you.
Follow that one.
With compassion.
Yeah, I had the profile early in my early life is to courageous. I have to be courageous, I have to be strong. I learned the hard way that even courage can be overwhelmed. That life can bring you suffering in ways that even your courage can be overwhelmed. But there were times in my life where this beautiful opening of the heart and tears come rolling down, and there is such empowerment there. It's far beyond courage. And sometimes courage is sort of the metaphor of a stick or of something really strong that's there, and you're trying to stay strong, but then a big typhoon comes and it just breaks. And compassion is more like the weed, it just kind of flows with life. Goes with life, and it just can never be broken. It seems weak because it's kind of just flowing, but actually it's stronger than the wood that can crack at some point, reaches a threshold and just breaks. I'll just give a recent example. My mom just had open heart surgery, and she's been 8 weeks in the hospital, and she's 82 years old, and it was touch and go. And after the operation, her kidneys failed, and they had her on a resuscitation to breathe. And the doctor was giving one of those speeches like, it's a difficult time. And she was coming in and out of consciousness. And at some point in the intensive care, they tied her up because they didn't want her, because she was sort of sedated, so they had to tie her up. And because she was old and she had a double valve change, and she didn't recover so quickly, she stayed in intensive care for 6 weeks alone, and we couldn't visit her. So we can only visit her for 20 minutes a day because they don't let visitors in intensive care. And it was really hard because at some point she was very conscious and she has tubes down her throat. You can imagine she has a feeding tube here. She's tied up. She can't move. And my mother's a very strong woman, and she was just shaking her hand, and there was this look in her eyes of just desperancy, like just really like, I can't take this anymore. Imagine it's kind of like solitary confinement because there's nobody there, and you can't even look at your watch, you can't even itch yourself, you're just staying there for 6 weeks. And my father, who's Greek, and so it's very about courage and strength, he couldn't handle it. It was just too much for him, even to connect with her, to come in the room with her, because it's just overwhelming for him. My father, who's this, mountain of courage. My brother came into the room, but for him it was, again, very uncomfortable. He didn't know how to deal with my mother's pain and suffering and desperancy. My sister and me, my father was giving us a lot of trouble because he's like, you're speaking to her, but she's getting more agitated by talking to her, and I think you shouldn't be, it's making her more desperate. But me and my sister were like, we want to talk to her, we want to connect with her, we want to tell her what's going on, because she didn't know what was happening and the operation was going on. My sister was coming from the place of, I gotta fix you, so she was like, everything's gonna be okay, Mom, da-da-da-da-da, and then she kept shaking and she kept moving, and you could see her, she was really suffering. And I just kissed her forehead, and I was, caressing her, and I was like, this is so, I used the bad language, this must be so fucking hard, Mom, I'm so sorry. And I was telling her this, and I was just trying to explain to her everything was going on, but I wasn't trying to fix her, I was just telling her, this is really hard for you. And tears started coming down her thing. And she literally smiled at me, and it was almost like compassion met her, and in this heat of just life and death situation, it was just kind of like a release, like, okay. Like, it just, the tears opened her heart, and she finally could just kind of let go right there. It was just like, she just kind of rested. And so, or another example is, my cousin, he very close to me, and he had cancer, and I hadn't seen him for many years, and I met him at this hotel and lobby in a bar, and I was really terrified to see him. I was young, I was in my 20s, and he was like a skeleton, half, dying. And I was trying to just, very uncomfortable, saying, oh, how are you feeling? And is there a new treatment? And da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And you can see that I was very restless. And he just reached over and grabbed my hand and said, it's okay. It's okay. I'm dying, but it's okay. He was so compassionate. He was like, he was the one dying. He was consoling me with his compassion, and I felt so uncomfortable beforehand. The minute he did that, he just melted my heart, and then there was just tears from both our sides, and we met that death, that suffering, that cancer right there. Nothing was fixed. He was still dying. There was still a fire there. He had to deal with chemotherapy, and he died in the end. But it was one of the truest moments I've ever lived, because he faced death straight on with an open heart and with compassion. And it was one of the greatest lessons, because that was courage for me, but from an open-hearted, compassionate perspective. So I think with an open-hearted, compassionate way of life, we can face death, we can face life, we can face the greatest difficulties. And it doesn't mean we whitewash it, it doesn't mean that it goes away, it doesn't mean we can fix it. But sometimes in that intimacy is where everything opens. Everything, the magic opens. And so I invite us all to continuously open that heart and find ways to open that heart. It's the only way forward, I think. Thank you so much for being here. See you tomorrow. What time? Yeah.
Yes. So tomorrow we are meeting again here at 10 o'clock in the morning. And tomorrow's whole sessions will be shorter, so we will finish before lunch around 12:30. And we also, probably you already know since you signed up for it, but the sessions. Some of you, we will start in the morning with NIPUN again, and then we will continue after coffee break with Mirela Ștețcu and Ioana Giga from Romania. And also, we will also have, I wanted to keep him as a surprise guest, but finally so we will also have Vlad Voiculescu joining us for a little while. He's coming from another TED Talk, from another city, so we're hoping it will be okay and be able to join us. But see you everyone back here at 10 o'clock in the morning. Thank you again for joining us and for staying until the end.
Thank you.